I was folding laundry on a Tuesday night when my brother called and told me our niece had stopped eating lunch at school because she was ashamed of what was in her lunchbox. That's how it started. Not with sirens, not with a police report, not with anything dramatic enough to make you sit up straight the first time you heard it. It started with a 9-year-old girl who would rather go hungry than let her classmates see a slice of bologna folded dry between two pieces of white bread, 5 days a week, month after month, while our parents' pantry sat 2 rooms away stocked with everything a child could want. My name is Rachel Ann Whitfield. I'm 36 years old. I live outside Columbus, Ohio, and for most of my life, I believed my parents were good people who had simply run out of steam by the time they got around to raising their grandchildren. I want to tell you what actually happened, because I spent a long time making excuses for 2 people who did not deserve them, and I don't want anyone else to spend that long doing the same thing I did. I want you to hear this the way I lived it, slowly, in pieces, with denial doing most of the talking until it couldn't talk anymore. My brother Daniel is 4 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one who threw himself in front of things. Bad grades, broken curfews, the occasional dented fender, so that I could coast along behind him looking like the easy child. He wasn't reckless. He just had more life in him than our house had room for. Our parents, Gerald and Linda Whitfield, ran a tight, quiet household in a small town called Millbrook, about 40 minutes from where I live now. My father worked 31 years for the same manufacturing company before he retired with a pension he was prouder of than almost anything else in his life. My mother taught 3rd grade for 2 decades and then complained for another decade about how children today had no discipline. They were the kind of people neighbors described as solid, church-going, punctual. The kind of family that sent thank you cards for thank you cards. What I didn't understand until much later is that solid and warm are not the same word, and that a house can run like a Swiss watch and still be a cold place for a child to grow up in. Daniel met his wife, Melissa, when he was 26. She was a nurse, funny in a dry, understated way, the kind of person who could diffuse an argument with one perfectly timed sentence. I loved her instantly, the way you love the person who makes your sibling laugh in a way you've never heard them laugh before. They got married in a barn venue outside of Zanesville with string lights and a bluegrass band, and I stood up as a bridesmaid and cried through the whole first dance like an idiot. 3 years later, they had Ava. I remember holding her in the hospital, this small, furious pink thing with a full head of dark hair, and thinking that I had never in my life wanted to protect something so badly. Daniel cried when he held her. Melissa glowed, exhausted and radiant in that hospital bed, and for a few years, everything about that little family looked like the thing the rest of us were quietly jealous of. Then Melissa got sick. It was ovarian cancer, caught late because the symptoms mimic so many ordinary things: bloating, fatigue, a stomach that never quite feels right. Ava was 5 when Melissa was diagnosed, and 6 when she died. I won't spend a long time on those 13 months because they are not really the subject of this story, but I need you to understand what my brother was carrying when the rest of this began. He watched his wife shrink over the course of a year. He held her hand in a hospice room with a 6-year-old daughter down the hall, being babysat by a rotation of relatives who didn't know what to say to a child whose mother was dying. He buried Melissa on a gray October afternoon, and then he drove home to a house full of her clothes and her handwriting on sticky notes on the refrigerator, and he had to figure out, essentially overnight, how to be a single father to a 6-year-old girl who had just lost the center of her entire world. I want to be fair to my parents here, because fairness is something I promised myself I would hold on to through all of this, even when it stopped being easy. In those first months after Melissa died, my parents did show up. My mother brought casseroles. My father mowed Daniel's lawn without being asked. They took Ava for weekend sleepovers so Daniel could have 2 days to simply collapse, which every single parent I have ever met needs after a loss like that. For a while, I thought, this is going to be hard. But Ava has people. She has us. Daniel worked as a field service engineer for an industrial equipment company, a job that had him traveling several days a week to repair machinery at plants across 3 states. It was good money, genuinely good money, enough that after Melissa's medical bills he was still able to keep the house and start rebuilding some savings. But it was not compatible with being a single father to a young child with no other parent to fall back on. For the first year after Melissa's death, he tried to make it work with a patchwork of after-school care, a neighbor who helped in emergencies, and cutting his travel down as much as his company would allow. It was exhausting. He was gray around the eyes all the time. I'd call him and hear him trying to sound normal, while I could hear Ava crying for her mother in the background, at bedtime, at bath time, at any quiet moment when there was nothing to distract her from the hole in the middle of her life. About 14 months after Melissa passed, my parents made an offer that, on paper, looked like a gift. "Let Ava live with us during the week," my mother said over Sunday dinner, while my father nodded along like this had been his idea too, though I suspect it was entirely hers. "You keep your job, you keep your house, you take her on weekends and whenever you're between trips. She needs stability, Daniel, and bouncing between sitters and aftercare programs isn't stability. We're right here. We're retired. We have room." I remember sitting at that table and feeling something in me relax, actually relax, at the idea. My parents were retired. My father had built a good addition onto the house years earlier when he thought one of us might move back home with grandkids someday. There was a bedroom that could be Ava's. There was a big fenced yard. There was, on paper, exactly the kind of stable, resourced, available household that a grieving little girl needed. Daniel cried at that table. He said, "Thank you," about 6 times. He said he didn't know how he would have kept going without them. I want you to remember that moment, because it is going to come up again later, in a room with much colder lighting, in front of a woman in a black robe who was going to ask my parents, under oath, whether they remembered making that exact promise. For the first year or so, from what I could see, it wasn't bad. Was it perfect? No. My mother was never a woman who got down on the floor and played dolls, the way Melissa used to. She wasn't the type to do voices during a bedtime story. But she fed Ava, got her to school, went to a couple of her school events, and when I visited on holidays, Ava seemed not glowing, not thriving, but okay. A kid still grieving her mother, living with grandparents who were not naturally warm people, but who were, I believed, trying. I want to be honest about something uncomfortable. I lived 40 minutes away. I had my own life, my own 2 kids at the time. My daughter Emma was 4, and my son Nathaniel was 2, and I did not visit as often as I should have. I told myself Ava had enough people around her. I told myself my parents, whatever their limitations, would never actually let a child go without. I told myself a lot of things over the next few years that let me stay comfortably in my own house, folding my own laundry, instead of asking harder questions. That comfort ended on a Tuesday night, 3 years after Ava moved in with my parents, when Daniel called me sounding like a man who had just found something he could not unsee. "She hasn't been eating her lunch," he told me. His voice had a flat, controlled quality that I recognized from the year Melissa was dying, the sound of a person holding a scream very far down in their chest. "Her teacher called me today, said Ava's been throwing her lunch away every day for weeks. When they finally got her to explain why, she said the other kids make fun of what's in it. Rachel, it's the same thing every single day. White bread, 1 slice of bologna, no cheese, no mustard, nothing else, no fruit, no snack. Sometimes not even a napkin. She's 9 years old and she's been quietly starving herself at school rather than let anyone see what mom and dad are giving her. I stood in my laundry room holding a stack of my son's t-shirts, and for a moment I genuinely could not make my mouth produce words. Not because I didn't believe him. Because some small, ugly, self-protective part of me believed him instantly, and that instant recognition terrified me more than doubt would have. Because if I believed it that easily, some part of me must have already known something was wrong and simply chosen not to look at it. "Have you talked to Mom?" I finally asked. "I called her right after I hung up with the teacher," Daniel said. "You want to know what she said to me?" She said, and I quote, "Well, I'm not running a 5-star restaurant, Daniel. She's lucky to have food at all." I sat down on the floor of my laundry room, right there on the tile, with my son's tiny shirts in my lap, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had been sealed shut for a very long time. The last thin membrane of the story I had been telling myself, the one where my parents were simply not warm people, but were, underneath it, decent people who would never let a child suffer. That phone call was the beginning. I didn't know yet how deep it went. I didn't know about the bedroom door with the child-proof knob cover installed on the outside, not the inside. I didn't know about the school records. I didn't know that in about 8 months I would be sitting in a wood-paneled courtroom in Franklin County listening to a judge read my own mother's text messages back to her, word for word, in a voice so quiet and so precise that I watched my mother's face go the color of old paper. But that phone call is where I have to start. Because that's where it started for me, not with the neglect itself, which had apparently been building for a long time, but with the moment I stopped being able to look away from it. I drove to my parents' house the next afternoon without calling ahead, which was something I almost never did. I told myself I wanted to see Ava, that this was just a normal visit, an aunt checking in on her niece. Nothing accusatory about it. I think some part of me needed to believe that lie in order to make myself get in the car, because if I had admitted out loud that I was going to inspect my own parents' home for signs that they were failing their granddaughter, I might have talked myself out of it entirely, the way I had talked myself out of asking harder questions for 3 straight years. My mother answered the door in her gardening clothes, mildly surprised, faintly suspicious in the way she always was when anything deviated from her expectations. "Rachel, we weren't expecting you." "I know, I was in the area. I wanted to see Ava." "She's at school," she told me. "It's a Wednesday afternoon." Of course she's at school, and I felt like an idiot for not accounting for that, which tells you something about the state my brain was in, running on adrenaline and dread, rather than logic. My mother let me in anyway, and I used the excuse of using the bathroom to walk down the hallway toward the bedrooms, my heart going harder than it should have for such a mundane task. Ava's door was closed. I opened it. I want to describe this room to you carefully, because I have replayed it in my mind so many times since that I can still see every detail with total clarity. The way you remember the room you were standing in when you got terrible news. It was small, smaller than I remembered, though I hadn't been in there in over a year. There was a twin bed with a thin comforter that I recognized as one my mother had owned since before I was born. Faded roses on a background that had once been cream and was now the color of weak tea. There was no other bedding visible, no extra blanket, though it was late October and the nights had already turned cold. There was a single dresser with 3 drawers, one of which didn't close all the way, because it was overstuffed with what looked like every piece of clothing Ava owned, jammed in without any folding. There was no closet rod. I realized after a second that the closet had been converted into storage for my parents' old holiday decorations, boxes stacked floor to ceiling, so that Ava's clothes had nowhere to go but that single dresser. There was no desk, no bookshelf, no toys that I could see, except a single stuffed rabbit sitting on the pillow, worn nearly bald in patches, which I recognized. My chest tightened when I placed it. As the rabbit Melissa had given Ava the day she was born. On the wall, there was nothing. No photos, no drawings, no height chart, no school certificates. Nothing that indicated a child actually lived in this room and was growing up in it. It looked like a guest room that someone slept in occasionally, not like the bedroom of a 9-year-old girl who had lived there for 3 years. I stood in that doorway for a long moment, and then I walked back out to the kitchen, where my mother was starting to make herself a cup of tea, humming faintly, entirely unbothered. "Mom," I said. "Ava's room. What about it? There's nothing in it. There's no toys, no pictures. It doesn't look like anyone lives there." My mother set her mug down with a small, precise click. "Rachel, I don't know what you expect. Children today are given far too much. Every surface covered in plastic junk. I'm not interested in raising a child surrounded by clutter." "She's 9. 9-year-olds have stuff, Mom. Books, drawings, something." "She has books. She has a library card." My mother's voice had gone into the register I remembered from childhood, the one that meant this conversation was over whether I agreed or not. "I don't appreciate you coming into my house and inspecting things like you're from social services." That word, social services, sat in the air between us like something she had thrown down as a challenge, daring me to make it real. I didn't. Not that day. I told her I was worried, that Daniel had told me about the lunches, and my mother's face did something I want to describe precisely, because it is the thing I keep coming back to when people ask me how she could have done what she did. She didn't look ashamed. She didn't look defensive exactly. She looked mildly, genuinely irritated, the way a person looks when they feel they are being unfairly criticized for a reasonable decision. "I'm not made of money, Rachel," she said. "Your father and I are on a fixed income. We took this child in out of the goodness of our hearts, and now everyone wants to tell us we're not doing it right. Do you know what it costs to feed a growing child? Do you know what our grocery bill looks like?" I want to pause here and tell you something I found out much, much later, because it matters enormously to understanding what actually happened in that house. My parents were not, in fact, on some desperate fixed income scraping by. My father's pension, combined with my mother's teacher's pension and their Social Security, put their monthly household income at a little over $6,000 a month for 2 retired people with a paid-off house and a paid-off car. And on top of that, this is the detail that would later matter more than almost anything else in this entire story. When Daniel agreed to have Ava live with our parents, he had set up a monthly transfer to help cover her expenses. $400 a month, deposited directly into my mother's checking account, specifically earmarked, in his words in the text message he sent her at the time, for food, clothes, school stuff, whatever Ava needs. Just let me know if it's not enough, and I'll add more. My mother never once, in 3 years, told him it wasn't enough. She never asked for more. And as I would learn during the custody proceedings, when a forensic accountant hired by my brother's attorney pulled 3 years of bank statements, that $400 a month had not been going toward bologna sandwiches and a threadbare comforter. It had been going, almost entirely, into a savings account in my parents' name that had, by the time this all came to a head, grown to just over $16,000. I didn't know any of that yet, standing in that kitchen. All I knew was that my mother was telling me she was struggling financially while wearing a new fleece vest I recognized from a recent Bass Pro Shops receipt I'd seen open on her counter, and that my niece was living in a room that looked like nobody's home. I left that day without resolving anything. I told my mother I loved her, which was true, and that I was worried about Ava, which was also true, and she told me I was overreacting, which I desperately wanted to believe and did not, in my gut, believe at all. I called Daniel from my car in the driveway before I even pulled out. I went to see the room, I told him. Danny, it's bad. It's really bad. There was a long silence on the line. Then he said, in a voice that broke my heart because it sounded so much like the voice of the little boy I grew up with, the one who used to take the blame for things so I wouldn't get in trouble. I've been telling myself for 3 years that I was doing the right thing, giving her stability. What if I just handed my daughter to 2 people who don't actually want her? I didn't have an answer for him that day. But I told him I would help him find out the truth, whatever it turned out to be. And that promise is the reason I ended up spending the next 8 months of my life becoming something between a detective and a court witness in a case against my own parents. The first person I talked to, before I talked to anyone else, was Ava's teacher. Her name was Ms. Denise Okafor, and she taught 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary, the same school Daniel and I had both attended 30 years earlier. I called the school office and asked if I could arrange a meeting as Ava's aunt, and Ms. Okafor, to her enormous credit, and I will be grateful to this woman for the rest of my life, agreed to meet with me the following afternoon after dismissal, once she'd confirmed with the office that I was, in fact, a blood relative, and not some stranger fishing for information. I sat across from her in a classroom full of construction paper leaves and a reading corner with a threadbare rug, and she looked at me for a long moment before she spoke, like she was deciding how much to say. I've been documenting things, she said finally. I want you to know that up front, because I think you're here for a reason, and I think it's the same reason I've been keeping a folder in my desk drawer since September. I felt my stomach drop and lift at the same time, dread and relief tangled together, because someone else had seen it too, someone with no stake in our family's dysfunction, someone whose observations would carry weight that mine never could. Ms. Okafor told me that Ava had started the school year seeming a little quiet, a little tired, which she initially chalked up to what she called the ordinary rhythms of grief. Ava had lost her mother after all, and grief doesn't stay in a straight line. But by October, patterns had started to worry her. Ava was falling asleep at her desk 2 or 3 times a week. She came to school in the same 3 or 4 outfits on rotation, sometimes with visible stains that hadn't been washed out. Her homework folder frequently didn't come back signed, not because Ava hadn't done the work, but because Ms. Okafor said this part carefully. She told me once that she didn't want to bother her grandma with it. Then there were the lunches. I want to be careful here, Ms. Okafor said, because I know food insecurity looks different in every family, and I don't want to assume the worst about people I've never met. But this wasn't a family struggling to put food on the table. Ava told me. This was back in September, before it got bad enough that she stopped eating altogether, that her grandmother said making lunch every day was, and I'm quoting a 9-year-old's memory of this, too much work for one kid. She said her grandpa eats a hot lunch delivered from a diner in town most days. She said there are snacks in the pantry that are for grandma and grandpa's TV nights that she's not allowed to have. I sat there with my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had gone white, listening to a woman describe my parents' house in language that made it sound like a household running some kind of internal caste system. One where the child who lived there full-time was treated as a lesser occupant than the 2 adults who had, ostensibly, taken her in out of love. When did she stop eating lunch entirely? I asked. About 3 weeks ago. She started throwing it away rather than let the other kids see it. Apparently some kids had commented on it. Kids can be cruel about that kind of thing without meaning real harm. They're just noticing and saying so out loud the way kids do, and rather than tell an adult, she just started skipping lunch. I only found out because our cafeteria monitor noticed her sitting with an untouched tray for the 4th day in a row and flagged it to me. Ms. Okafor pulled out the folder she'd mentioned. Inside were dated notes. Actual contemporaneous notes, the gold standard of evidence, as I would later learn from Daniel's attorney, describing incidents across 4 months. Notes about Ava falling asleep in class. Notes about a field trip permission slip that came back 3 weeks late with a form Ava had apparently filled out and signed herself, in a shaky 9-year-old approximation of an adult signature, because, again, in Ava's own words, relayed secondhand. Grandma said she didn't have time to deal with it. Notes about a January day when Ava came to school without a coat in 22-degree weather, and when the school called home to ask that one be sent, was told by my mother that Ava has a coat, she just doesn't like to wear it, which the teacher noted was almost certainly untrue, because Ava had cried with relief when the school nurse gave her one of the spares kept in the nurse's office for exactly this situation. I made 2 calls to the county's child welfare line, Ms. Okafor told me, and I felt my whole body go still. Both times, a caseworker did a home visit. Both times, I was told the case was closed due to insufficient evidence of neglect. I want to be honest with you. This happens more than people realize. The threshold for removing a child, or even for a formal finding, is very high. And rightly so, because we don't want kids pulled from homes over a messy room. A cold sandwich and a messy room, taken separately, don't meet that threshold. It's the pattern that worries me, and I don't have the authority to force anyone to look at the pattern the way I see it, sitting here every day watching one child's slow decline while everyone around her insists nothing is wrong. I asked her, because I had to, whether she thought Ava was in danger. Real danger. Physical danger. Not just an unhappy home. She thought about this for a long time before answering. I don't think anyone is hitting her, if that's what you mean. I've never seen a mark on her, and mandated reporters are trained to look. But I think that child has learned at 9 years old that her needs are an inconvenience to the people responsible for her. I think she has learned to make herself small and quiet and undemanding because the alternative is being made to feel like a burden. And I think, she said, closing the folder gently, like she was closing a door on something painful. That kind of learning does damage that doesn't show up on a body. It shows up 20 years later in therapy, if she's lucky enough to get there. I left that meeting and sat in my car in the school parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive. Then I called Daniel and told him everything, and I heard him, on the other end of the line, start to cry in a way I had only heard once before, in a hospice hallway 3 years earlier. I have to get her out of there, he said. Rachel, I have to get her out of there, and I don't know how, because legally they have physical custody arrangements I agreed to, and I don't even know what my rights are right now. Then we find out, I told him. Whatever it takes. I'm not letting this go. I didn't know yet what whatever it takes would actually mean. I didn't know it would mean months of documentation, a private investigator I would end up paying for out of my own savings, a family law attorney with a reputation for taking difficult custody modifications, a series of increasingly ugly confrontations with my own mother, and eventually, a courtroom in downtown Columbus, where I would sit in the gallery and watch a judge's face change as she read text messages my mother had sent to her sister, bragging about how much money she was saving by not spending Daniel's monthly contribution the way it was meant to be spent. But that night, all I knew was that my niece was 9 years old, that she had learned to go hungry rather than be a bother, and that I was done pretending I hadn't seen it. I am not, by nature, a confrontational person. For most of my adult life, I have been the sibling who smoothed things over, who called my mother back after she said something cutting and pretended not to remember it, who believed that keeping the peace was its own kind of virtue. That version of me would have called my mother, cried a little, maybe sent Ava a care package, and told myself I had done something. That version of me died somewhere in Ms. Okafor's classroom, looking at a folder of dated notes describing my niece's slow disappearance into invisibility. The version of me that drove home that night called a family law attorney the following morning. Her name was Patricia Nguyen, and she had a reputation in Central Ohio. I found her through a friend who'd gone through a brutal custody dispute of her own for taking on cases other attorneys considered unwinnable, specifically cases where a parent needed to modify or revoke an informal custody arrangement with grandparents who had, in her words when I met her, made themselves comfortable in a role they were never supposed to keep. I want to explain something about the legal landscape here, because it matters for understanding why this took as long as it did and why it was so much harder than simply calling the police and having Ava removed the next day. Daniel had never given up legal custody of Ava. He was, and remained, throughout this entire ordeal, her sole legal parent and guardian. What existed between him and our parents was an informal physical custody arrangement. Ava lived at their house during the week as a practical matter, but there was no court order requiring this, nothing that stripped Daniel of his rights. In theory, he could have shown up at my parents' house any day and taken Ava home with him. In practice, it was far more complicated than that. Daniel's job required travel that made him, by his own admission, unable to provide the day-to-day supervision a 9-year-old needed on a consistent basis. If he simply pulled Ava out of my parents' home and something went wrong, if he had to take an emergency work trip and scrambled for childcare, if any documentation existed suggesting instability on his end, my parents, who I was quickly coming to understand, were far more calculating than I had ever given them credit for, could turn around and file for a formal custody arrangement themselves, arguing that they had been Ava's primary caregivers for 3 years and that removing her from the only stable home she'd known, so soon after losing her mother, would be traumatic and against her best interests. Patricia explained this to me and Daniel together, in her office, with a bluntness I appreciated even as it terrified me. If this were a case of obvious physical abuse, bruises, a hospital visit, something a judge can look at and immediately understand as danger, this would move fast. Neglect is slower and harder to prove, especially neglect that doesn't rise to the level of medical emergency. What you're describing to me, the lunches, the room, the coat, the missed forms, this is what family court calls chronic, low-grade neglect. It's real. It's damaging. Judges take it seriously when it's well documented, but well documented is the key phrase. A judge is not going to modify a 3-year custody arrangement, even an informal one, based on one aunt's bad feeling and one teacher's folder, sympathetic as that folder might be. We need more. We need a pattern so clear and so well documented that no reasonable person could look at it and conclude these children were being adequately cared for. That was the moment I understood what the next several months of my life were going to look like. We started, at Patricia's direction, by formalizing what Ms. Okafor had already gathered. She agreed, cautiously, aware of her own professional exposure, but genuinely, I believe, out of concern for Ava, to provide a written statement summarizing her observations, along with copies of her dated notes, though she made clear she would need to be subpoenaed rather than volunteer information informally to protect the school district. Patricia said that was fine, that was actually better, because a subpoenaed teacher's testimony carries more institutional weight than a favor called in by a worried aunt. Then Patricia recommended a private investigator, a retired police detective named Frank Wisniewski, who specialized in exactly this kind of documentation, not surveillance in the dramatic sense, nothing illegal, but a careful, methodical gathering of public records, school records requested through proper channels with Daniel's authorization as legal guardian, and, when Daniel agreed to it, some limited external observation of the home from public property, time-stamped and dated, to establish patterns. I want to tell you honestly that hiring a private investigator to watch my own parents' house felt like one of the most surreal things I have ever done. I remember sitting in my car outside Frank's office with the engagement paperwork on the passenger seat, feeling like I had stepped into someone else's life. These were the people who taught me to ride a bike. These were the people who sat in the front row at my wedding. And now I was paying a former detective to build a case documenting their failures as caregivers. I called Daniel that night and asked him, not for the first time, whether we were doing the right thing. "I keep thinking about the bologna sandwich," he said. "I keep thinking about my daughter sitting in a cafeteria, hungry, too ashamed to tell anyone, because somewhere along the way, she learned that's just what she gets. Rachel, I don't care what it costs. I don't care how it looks. I am not spending one more month telling myself this is fine." Over the following 6 weeks, a picture assembled itself that was worse, in its accumulation, than any single detail had been on its own. School records, obtained through a formal request Daniel submitted as Ava's legal guardian, showed a pattern of 17 tardy arrivals over the fall semester, all attributed to overslept, ran late, with several notations from the front office about Ava arriving without a packed breakfast on mornings when the district's free breakfast program, available to any student, no application required, had apparently gone unmentioned to her, so that she simply sat some mornings without eating until lunchtime, when she then declined to eat that too. Frank's investigation turned up something I had genuinely not expected: a pattern of near-daily deliveries from a diner in downtown Millbrook to my parents' address, 6 days a week, time-stamped for lunch, which, cross-referenced with Ava's school attendance, since she was obviously at school during those hours, appeared to correspond to meals for my parents alone. Frank was careful to note this wasn't proof of anything by itself. People are allowed to order lunch delivery. But combined with what Ms. Okafor had described, a grandmother who found daily lunch preparation too much work for one kid, while apparently having no trouble arranging daily restaurant delivery for herself and my father, it painted a picture of priorities that would matter enormously later. The detail that undid me most, though, came from an unexpected source: Ava's pediatrician's office. Daniel, as her legal guardian, was still listed as the parent of record and could request her medical history at any time. When he pulled it, he found that Ava had missed 2 consecutive years of well-child visits, the annual checkups pediatricians recommend for every child, covered entirely by the insurance Daniel paid for through his employer, because my mother had never scheduled them. When Daniel called the pediatrician's office directly to ask about this, the office manager told him, somewhat apologetically, that they had sent 3 separate reminder postcards to the address on file over those 2 years, and that when a nurse finally called to follow up after the second missed year, my mother had told her, according to the office's own call log, that Ava was healthy as a horse. "We don't need to make a fuss over a checkup." Ava was 9 years old and had not seen a doctor in over 2 years. Her vision had never been screened. Her growth had never been tracked. If something had been quietly wrong with her, and children her age, we would learn later, are supposed to be screened for exactly the kinds of things that don't announce themselves loudly, no one would have known, because the appointments meant to catch, it had simply never been made. I called my mother once during this period, near the end of it, in what I told myself was a final good faith attempt to give her the chance to fix things before this went any further. I didn't tell her about Frank, or Patricia, or the records Daniel had requested. I simply asked her, as gently as I could manage, whether she thought Ava might benefit from a few changes: a warmer room, regular checkups, maybe a little more attention to the lunches. "You have always thought you knew better than me," my mother said, in a voice that had gone cold and clipped in a way I recognized from my own childhood. The tone she used right before a punishment was handed down. "I raised 2 children who turned out fine. I don't need parenting advice from my daughter who thinks she's better than me because she reads articles on the internet. Ava is fed, she is housed, she is loved. And frankly, Rachel, I am tired of everyone acting like I owe them a performance of gratitude for taking on a child at my age, at my expense, out of the goodness of my heart. At your expense? I said before I could stop myself. Danny sends you $400 a month. There was a pause on the line, just slightly too long, and my mother said, "That barely covers groceries." In a tone that I would later understand, once I saw the bank statements, was a lie so casual it barely registered to her as one. I hung up that phone call and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I remember my daughter Emma, who was 7 then, coming in and asking why I looked sad, and I told her I was just tired, which was true in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The confrontation that finally broke things open didn't come from any of the documentation we'd gathered. It came, as these things so often do, from something small and stupid and entirely unplanned. A weekend visit that was supposed to be ordinary and ended up being the last weekend Ava ever spent in that house. It was a Friday in early March, about 2 months after that phone call with Ms. Okafor. Daniel had a scheduled weekend with Ava. Every other weekend, plus Wednesday dinners, was the informal rhythm they'd settled into, and he picked her up from my parents' house after school, the way he always did. He called me that night, and I could hear immediately from his voice that something had happened. "She had a fever," he said, 101.3. "She's had a cough for 4 days, Rachel." 4 days. Mom knew. She told me, when I asked, that she figured it was just a cold and didn't want to make a fuss. 4 days of a cough, and she never mentioned it to me, never took her to urgent care, never even gave her children's Tylenol from what I can tell, because there wasn't any in the house when I looked. I drove to Daniel's house that night, worried about Ava, worried about my brother, who sounded like a man standing at the edge of something. When I got there, Ava was asleep on the couch under a blanket, her cheeks flushed with fever, and Daniel was sitting at his kitchen table with his head in his hands. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if this had turned into something worse," he said, not looking up. "Pneumonia. Something that actually needed a hospital. 4 days, Rachel. 4 days of a sick kid, and nobody thought that was worth a phone call to her father." We sat with Ava that whole weekend, and something in Daniel had shifted by Sunday night in a way I could see in his posture, the set of his jaw. When it came time to take her back to our parents' house Sunday evening, he didn't go. He called our mother instead. I was there for that call. He put it on speaker, which I think he did deliberately, so there would be a witness, a habit he'd apparently already started picking up from conversations with Patricia. "I'm keeping her this week," he told our mother. "She's still got a cough. I want to keep an eye on her, and I've got some things I need to figure out with her school and her doctor anyway." "Daniel, that's not the arrangement," my mother said, her voice sharpening immediately. "She has school Monday. All her things are here. This is completely disorganized of you." "I'll bring her school stuff from the emergency bag she keeps at my place," Daniel said, his voice flat, and even in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before, not once in his life. "I'm not asking permission, Mom. She's my daughter. I'm keeping her this week." There was a long silence on the line. Then my mother said something that I want to record here exactly as she said it, because it was the first moment I truly understood what we were dealing with. Not a grieving grandmother stretched too thin, but something colder and more self-interested than I had let myself imagine. "If you take her out of this house permanently, Daniel, you understand we're not obligated to just hand back 3 years of expenses we've absorbed. There have been costs. If this is you trying to renegotiate things, we can talk to a lawyer too." Daniel looked at me across the kitchen table, and I watched something in his face go very still and very clear, the way ice looks right before it cracks. "Do that," he said. "Talk to a lawyer. I'll have mine call yours." He hung up the phone. Ava, still on the couch, stirred and asked sleepily what was going on, and Daniel went and sat beside her and told her gently that she was going to stay with him for a while, that they'd figure out school together, and that everything was going to be okay. I watched my 9-year-old niece, flushed with fever, ask her father in a small voice, "Is Grandma mad at me?" Not, "Am I in trouble?" Not, "Did I do something wrong?" "Is Grandma mad at me?" As though her grandmother's moods were a weather system Ava had spent 3 years learning to read and navigate around, the way you'd learn to read a parent's moods if you were used to walking on eggshells. Daniel told her no, she hadn't done anything, that none of this was her fault. And I watched him say it with a conviction that made it clear he was also, in that exact moment, saying it to convince himself. That was the weekend everything changed. Ava never went back to live in that house again. Once Ava was living with Daniel full-time, the legal picture shifted, but it did not simplify. If anything, it became more urgent, because now there was a 9-year-old girl in a small 2-bedroom rental with a father who traveled for work, no formal custody order protecting that arrangement, and grandparents who had just threatened, in plain language, to hire a lawyer of their own. Patricia moved quickly. Within a week, she had filed on Daniel's behalf for a formal custody order, not because he needed one to have Ava with him, since he was already her legal guardian, but because, as she explained, informal arrangements can be challenged informally. A judge's order cannot. "I want a document in a file with a judge's signature on it that says, unambiguously, where this child lives and why." At the same time, Patricia brought in the forensic accountant I mentioned earlier, a meticulous, soft-spoken woman named Carol Ibarra, who specialized in exactly this kind of financial reconstruction: divorce cases, elder financial abuse cases, and, increasingly, she told us, custody cases where money turned out to be doing more of the talking than anyone wanted to admit. Daniel authorized Carol to request 3 years of banking records from the account he'd been depositing his monthly contributions into. This required a subpoena, since my parents obviously weren't going to volunteer their financial statements, and it took several weeks to come through. When it finally did, Carol sat across from Daniel and me at Patricia's conference table with a folder of spreadsheets and a face that told me, before she said a word, that we were not going to like what we were about to hear. "Over 36 months, Carol said, your father deposited $14,400 into this account, all from Daniel's monthly contributions of $400, with 3 months where he'd bumped it up to $500 after specifically asking your mother if Ava needed anything extra for the school year." She slid a spreadsheet across the table. "I traced the outflows from this account as carefully as the records allow. Some of it, certainly, went to groceries and household expenses, though I want to note that the grocery spending in this account did not meaningfully increase after Ava moved in, compared to the 12 months prior. It went up by roughly 11%. For context, USDA cost of raising a child estimates would suggest food costs for a household should increase significantly more than that when adding a growing 9- and 10-year-old. "Where did the rest go?" Daniel asked, though I could tell from his face he already suspected the answer. Carol turned to the next page. "A recurring monthly transfer, beginning 4 months after Ava moved in, and continuing consistently since, into a separate savings account held jointly by your parents. The transfers range from $200 to $350 a month, deposited within days of receiving your contribution. As of the most recent statement I was able to obtain, that savings account holds $16,211. I remember the silence in that room. Daniel didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then he said, very quietly, "They were saving my money. Money I gave them to feed my daughter. They were putting it away." "I want to be precise about what I can and can't say as an accountant," Carol said carefully. "I cannot tell you their intent. People save money for all kinds of reasons, and it's possible to construct an innocent explanation, building a cushion in case of emergency, for instance. What I can tell you, factually, is that the money you designated for Ava's care was not, in large part, spent on Ava's care. And I can tell you that during the same period this savings account was growing, your daughter had 2 consecutive missed years of routine medical care that would have been fully covered by your insurance, at zero cost to your parents, if only someone had scheduled the appointment. That was the moment the story stopped being, in my mind, a story about grandparents who were simply too old, too tired, too limited in their emotional resources to properly raise a grieving 9-year-old. It became a story about a choice. A repeated, monthly, deliberate choice to prioritize a savings account balance over a child's coat, a child's checkup, a child's lunch. Carol found other things too, smaller but no less telling once you understood the pattern. A membership to a wine club, $42 a month, that had started around the same time Ava moved in and continued uninterrupted. A weekly restaurant delivery habit that, over 3 years, Carol conservatively estimated at over $6,000, virtually all of it based on delivery timing corresponding to school hours, consumed by my parents alone. A new recliner bought with cash 8 months into Ava's stay, the same month, Frank's investigation would later note, that Ava's dresser drawer that didn't close properly had first appeared in a photograph Daniel had taken during a weekend pickup, back when he still trusted things were fine and had simply snapped a picture of Ava's room to send to a friend, not knowing it would become evidence. I want to say something here that I have thought about a great deal since all of this happened, because I think it's important. And because I think people often want these stories to have a villain who is cartoonishly cruel, someone who could never be mistaken for a loving grandparent. My mother was not that. She showed up to Ava's school events, at least the ones that didn't require much effort. She could be genuinely affectionate in small moments. I have a memory, even from that period, of her braiding Ava's hair before a school picture day, humming while she did it, and Ava looking, in that moment, genuinely content. My mother was not a monster in every hour of every day. She was, I came to understand, a person who had decided, somewhere along the way, that a grieving child's needs were negotiable against her own comfort, and who had made that negotiation, quietly, hundreds of times over 3 years, in ways small enough that she could tell herself none of them mattered. That is, I think, a more uncomfortable truth than the cartoon version would have been. It would be easier if she were simply cruel. Instead, she was something more common and more insidious, a person capable of real tenderness who nonetheless chose, again and again, to protect her own convenience and her own bank balance over her granddaughter's basic well-being, and who had gotten so used to explaining this away to herself that she no longer registered it as a choice at all. The formal custody hearing was scheduled for the second week of June, nearly 4 months after Ava moved in with Daniel full-time. In the interim, Patricia had filed for, and was granted, a temporary custody order confirming Ava's placement with Daniel while the Fuller case was prepared. A relief, but not a resolution, because my parents, true to their word on that phone call, had retained an attorney of their own. His name was Gregory Halloran, and I want to be fair to him. He was doing his job, which was to represent his client's interests as forcefully as the law allowed. What that meant, in practice, was a filing that characterized my parents as devoted grandparents who had sacrificed their retirement to provide stability for a grieving child, only to have that child abruptly and traumatically removed by a father acting on unsubstantiated allegations stirred up by a meddling sister-in-law with no legal standing in the matter. I remember reading that phrase, meddling sister-in-law with no legal standing, and laughing, a short, ugly, disbelieving laugh, because it was such a precise inversion of everything that had actually happened. I hadn't stirred anything up. I had walked into a bedroom that looked like nobody lived in it and asked a question my own mother refused to answer honestly. The filing went on to argue that Ava had thrived in my parents' care, that any isolated incidents of missed appointments or unconventional lunches had been blown wildly out of proportion, and that removing her from the only stable home she had known since her mother's death was itself a form of trauma inflicted on the child by an impulsive father acting on emotion rather than her actual best interests. I want to tell you honestly that reading this filing frightened me more than anything Frank or Carol had uncovered, because it was so plausible sounding on its face. I could imagine a judge who didn't know the details reading it and thinking, reasonably, that this sounded like a family conflict getting out of hand, that maybe the truth was somewhere in the messy middle, that grandparents who'd taken in a grieving child deserved some benefit of the doubt. Patricia was not frightened by it at all. "This is exactly the argument I expected," she told us, in a strategy session about 3 weeks before the hearing. "And it's exactly why we spent the last several months building the file we built. Their entire case rests on the narrative that this was a loving, adequate home, and that any problems were minor and isolated. Our entire case is built on demonstrating that it was a documented, sustained pattern, corroborated by 4 independent sources who have no reason to lie: a teacher bound by professional obligations, a pediatrician's office with its own call logs, a forensic accountant working from bank records, and a private investigator's time-stamped methodical documentation. The strength of our case isn't any single piece of evidence. It's that none of it comes from you, or from Daniel, or from anyone with a personal stake in how this turns out. It comes from institutions and professionals with their own independent records." She also told us something I found strangely comforting, in a grim sort of way. "Judges see a lot of families where grandparents genuinely did their best under difficult circumstances and simply didn't have the resources or the health to do more, and they treat those families with enormous compassion, as they should. What judges do not treat kindly is evidence of deception. Caregivers who told a child's parent things were fine when they weren't, who misrepresented their financial capacity while diverting a child's designated support into personal savings, who ignored medical needs not because they lacked money, but because they lacked will. That's not a family that ran out of resources. That's a family that made choices, and judges can tell the difference if you give them enough to see it clearly." In the weeks leading up to the hearing, my parents made one more move that, in retrospect, probably did more damage to their case than anything Carol or Frank had found. They began, through Gregory, requesting extensive unsupervised visitation with Ava while the case was pending. Not the every other weekend arrangement Daniel had always maintained even after taking her back full-time, but an aggressive expansion, 3 weekends a month plus midweek overnight visits, filed as an emergency motion arguing that limiting Ava's contact with her grandparents was itself harmful to a child who had bonded deeply with them. Daniel, through Patricia, opposed the motion, and in his opposition, he included something that I think surprised even Patricia with its power. A letter, written by Ava herself, at her father's gentle suggestion, but entirely in her own 9-year-old words, describing what she wanted. I have permission from Daniel to include a portion of what Ava wrote, because he felt, and I agree, that her own voice matters more in telling this story than any adult summary of it ever could. She wrote, "I love Grandma and Grandpa, but I don't want to sleep at their house right now. At their house, I try to be quiet so I don't bother anyone. At my dad's house, I don't have to be quiet. I can ask for things and he doesn't get mad. I miss my mom every day, but living with my dad feels like the first time since she died that I'm not scared of doing something wrong. I don't want to go back to being scared." Patricia told us that when she read that letter to the judge handling the temporary motions, a different judge from the one who would eventually preside over the full custody hearing, The courtroom went completely silent, and the emergency motion for expanded visitation was denied within the week, with visitation remaining at the existing, more limited schedule pending the full hearing. I don't want to make this sound like my parents had no capacity for love. I don't think that's true, and I don't think it's fair. But I think there is a particular kind of tragedy in a 9-year-old girl writing, in her own hand, that her father's house is the first place since her mother's death where she hasn't been afraid of being a bother. And I think that sentence, more than any bank statement or missed appointment, is the truest evidence of what those 3 years had actually done to her. I need to tell you what happened to the rest of our family during this period, because it matters, and because it's the part of this story that surprised me most. More than the bank statements, more than the missed doctor's visits, more than my mother's cold voice on the phone. What surprised me was how many people I had known my entire life chose to take my parents' side, not because they doubted the facts, but because they found the facts inconvenient. My father's sister, my Aunt Diane, called me about 6 weeks before the hearing. I hadn't spoken to her in months, and I assumed, hopefully, that she was calling out of concern for Ava. Instead, she spent the first 10 minutes of the call telling me how disappointed she was that I would go after my own parents like this, how family disagreements should be handled at the dinner table, not in a courtroom, and how she worried this would destroy my parents' reputation in Millbrook, where they had lived for 40 years and where, she reminded me, everyone knew everyone. Their reputation, I said, and I remember my voice shaking with a fury I hadn't fully let myself feel until that exact moment. Diane. Ava went 2 years without seeing a doctor. She was eating a dry bologna sandwich alone in a bathroom stall so the other kids wouldn't see it. Are you telling me their reputation matters more than that? I'm telling you, Aunt Diane said, in a voice that had gone hard and final, that every family has its struggles, and airing them in public, dragging your own mother through a courtroom, is not something I would ever do to my parents. God rest their souls, no matter what they did or didn't do. I hung up on her. It was the first time in my life I had ever hung up on a family member, and I sat in my car afterward shaking, not from doubt, but from the vertigo of realizing that my own family's culture, the thing that had raised me, the thing I had absorbed as simply how things are done, considered a child's suffering less important than an adult's comfort, provided the adult in question was blood. My mother's younger brother, Uncle Paul, went the opposite direction, and I want to record that too, because it matters that not everyone in our family chose comfort over truth. Paul called Daniel directly, not me, and told him he'd go on record if it helped, that he had visited my parents' house twice over the past 3 years and had, both times, come away with an uneasy feeling he hadn't been able to name at the time. Something about how quiet Ava was, how she seemed to disappear into the background of every room rather than participating in it the way children usually do at family gatherings. I should have said something sooner, he told Daniel, in a conversation Daniel later relayed to me almost word for word, because it clearly meant a great deal to him. I told myself it wasn't my place. I'm telling you now because I don't want to be one more person who looked away. Patricia eventually took a statement from Uncle Paul as a supplementary witness, though she was careful to note that his observations, standing alone, were exactly the kind of soft evidence, a feeling, an impression, that a court would give limited weight to without the harder documentation to support it. But she said it mattered anyway, because it corroborated the picture from someone with no financial or legal stake in the outcome, someone who had simply noticed a child fading and hadn't known what to do about it. My own 2 children, Emma and Nathaniel, were young enough during this period that I tried to shield them from most of the specifics, though Emma, who was 7 and perceptive in the particular way 7-year-olds sometimes are, asked me one night at dinner why we weren't seeing Grandma and Grandpa Whitfield anymore. I told her, as simply and honestly as I could manage, that Grandma and Grandpa hadn't been taking good care of Cousin Ava, and that her Uncle Daniel and I were working to fix that, and that sometimes fixing things meant not seeing people for a while. "Is Ava okay now?" Emma asked, and I told her yes. She's living with Uncle Daniel now. She's safe. And Emma nodded with the total, uncomplicated satisfaction of a child who has just been given the only piece of information that actually mattered to her. I think about that exchange a lot, honestly, because it strips away everything I spent months agonizing over: the family loyalty, the fear of being the one who destroyed a relationship, the guilt over dragging my own parents into a courtroom, and reduces it to the only question that should have mattered from the beginning: is the child okay now? My 7-year-old understood that instinctively. In a way, it took me 3 years and a folder full of school records to fully absorb myself. I want to also tell you about the moment my mother tried to reach me directly, about a month before the hearing, in a way that I think reveals more about her state of mind than almost anything in the official filings. She showed up at my house on a Saturday morning, unannounced, standing on my front porch in a coat I remembered from a decade earlier, looking smaller than I remembered her being. I almost didn't let her in. Patricia had advised, generally, against unsupervised contact that could complicate the legal proceedings. But this was my mother, standing on my porch, and some old muscle memory in me opened the door before I'd fully decided to. She didn't apologize. I want to be clear about that, because for a long time afterward I found myself, in low moments, constructing a version of this visit in my memory where she had apologized, where there had been some crack of genuine remorse I could hold on to. There wasn't. What she said, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee she didn't drink, was this: "I don't understand how my own daughter could do this to me. I gave that girl a roof over her head for 3 years. Do you know what my life looked like before that? Quiet. My own house. My own routine. Your father and I finally getting to enjoy retirement after 40 years of working. I gave that up. I gave up my quiet life to take in a grieving child, and instead of gratitude, I get a courtroom. I get accountants going through my bank statements like I'm a criminal." "Mom," I said. She was hungry. She was scared to ask you for things. She went 2 years without a doctor's visit. "She was fed," my mother said, her voice rising. "She was never once hungry in that house, Rachel, and I resent the implication that I starved my own granddaughter. Every family makes compromises. Every child does chores, has rules, learns that the world doesn't revolve around them. I raised you and your brother the same way, and neither of you starved, did you? Neither of you turned out damaged." I sat across from my mother and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, that she genuinely believed what she was saying. She was not performing innocence for my benefit. She had constructed, somewhere in the last several months, a version of events in which she was the wronged party. A grandmother who had sacrificed her golden years for an ungrateful family, who was now punishing her for it with lawyers and accountants. And she had moved into that version so completely that the actual facts, the bank statements, the missed appointments, existed for her only as unfair attacks rather than as documented reality. "Mom," I said, "did you know Ava threw away her lunch every day for weeks because she was ashamed of it? Did you know that?" "Children are dramatic," my mother said. "Kids get embarrassed by all kinds of things. You want to make every small thing into a crisis. Did you know she hadn't seen a doctor in 2 years? She was healthy. I would have known if something was wrong." "How would you have known, Mom, if you never took her in to be checked?" My mother didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she stood up, said she could see I had already made up my mind, that I had always thought I was smarter than everyone else in this family, and left. the way she often left conversations she was losing, not with an apology, but with an exit. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after she left, and I cried. Not for the mother sitting across from me 20 minutes earlier, but for whatever version of my mother I had spent 36 years hoping existed underneath the one who actually did. The custody hearing took place over 2 days in the second week of June, in a courtroom in the Franklin County Domestic Relations Court, before a judge named the Honorable Patricia Yamamoto, a coincidence of first names with our own attorney that struck me, absurdly, as a good omen, though I don't put much stock in omens generally. I want to describe Judge Yamamoto to you, because her demeanor mattered enormously to how these 2 days unfolded. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a quiet, unhurried way of speaking, the kind of presence that made a room settle rather than tense up. She had, Patricia told us beforehand, a reputation among family law attorneys in Columbus for being exceptionally difficult to read during proceedings. She rarely reacted visibly to testimony, kept her expression carefully neutral, and was known for asking sharp, unexpected questions that revealed she had absorbed every detail of a case file, far more thoroughly than most judges managed given their caseloads. Daniel testified first. He described, in a voice that shook only twice, once talking about Melissa's death, once talking about the fever weekend, the arrangement he'd made with our parents, his understanding of what that arrangement was supposed to provide, and the gradual, sickening realization of what it had actually become. Gregory Halloran, cross-examining, tried to paint Daniel as a father who had essentially abandoned his parental responsibilities for 3 years and was now, guiltily, overcorrecting by attacking the grandparents who had covered for his absence. "Isn't it true," Gregory asked him, "that you yourself chose to place your daughter with your parents rather than restructure your career to care for her yourself?" "Yes," Daniel said, without flinching, which I think surprised Gregory, who had clearly expected defensiveness. "I made that choice because my parents told me they had the time, the resources, and the willingness to give her a stable home while I worked to support her. I trusted them with the most important thing in my life. I didn't know, until a teacher and a private investigator and a forensic accountant showed me otherwise, that they weren't doing what they told me they would do." "Isn't it convenient," Gregory pressed, "that you now blame your parents for problems that might simply be the result of your own extended absences?" "There's nothing convenient about any of this," Daniel said, and his voice, for the first time, cracked audibly. "I would have given anything for this not to be true. I would have given anything to still believe my parents were the people I thought they were 4 months ago. Finding out otherwise is the least convenient thing that has ever happened to me." I testified next, describing the bedroom, the lunches, my conversation with Ms. Okafor, the phone call with my mother about the fever. Gregory's cross-examination of me was gentler than I expected, focused mostly on trying to establish that I had a limited view into the day-to-day realities of my parents' household and might be drawing conclusions from insufficient information. I told him, honestly, that this was exactly why we had brought in independent witnesses whose observations didn't depend on my perspective at all. Ms. Okafor testified via subpoena, exactly as she'd predicted, and her testimony was, I think, the most quietly devastating of the entire hearing, precisely because she had no stake in the outcome and delivered every observation with the careful, measured precision of a professional documenting facts rather than a family member airing grievances. When Gregory tried to suggest that a 9-year-old's self-reported comments about her home life might be unreliable or exaggerated, Ms. Okafor said something that I watched land visibly on Judge Yamamoto's face. "I've taught 4th grade for 14 years, she said. Children exaggerate about all kinds of things. How far they can throw a ball, how many video games they own, how scary a movie was. I have never, in 14 years, had a child exaggerate about being embarrassed by their own lunch to the point of choosing hunger over humiliation. That is not the kind of thing children make up for attention. That is the kind of thing children hide, out of shame, and only reveal when the shame becomes unbearable. Carol Ibarra testified about the financial records, walking the court through her spreadsheets with the same careful, unemotional precision she'd shown us months earlier, letting the numbers speak for themselves rather than editorializing about what they might mean. But the testimony that I believe, in the end, decided this case, the moment Patricia had built her entire strategy toward, came on the second day, when my mother took the stand herself. My mother wore a navy blue blazer to the hearing, the kind of outfit she used to describe as presentable. The same outfit, more or less, that she wore to parent-teacher conferences when I was a child. She walked to the witness stand with her chin lifted in a way I recognized as her posture for enduring unfairness, the posture she used to adopt when a neighbor complained about our dog or when a store clerk questioned a return. It was the posture of a woman who believed, completely, that she was in the right and that everyone else simply needed to catch up. Gregory led her through a gentle, direct examination first, letting her describe, in her own words, the sacrifice of taking in a grieving 9-year-old at the age of 62, the meals she prepared, the school events she attended, the love she said she felt for her granddaughter. She was composed, even sympathetic, in a way that I watched land with at least some effect on the courtroom. I could see it in the way a few of the observers in the gallery, people I didn't know, nodded slightly during parts of her testimony. She was, I want to be honest, a believable witness, at least at first. She had spent her whole life being the kind of woman people believed. Then Patricia stood up for cross-examination, and I watched my mother's posture change almost imperceptibly, some old instinct in her recognizing an opponent she couldn't simply outlast with dignity. Patricia started slowly, almost gently, asking my mother to confirm the basic outline of the arrangement, the $400 a month, designated, in Daniel's own words, for food, clothes, school stuff, whatever Ava needs. Yes, my mother said. That's correct. And did you ever tell Daniel that $400 wasn't enough to cover Ava's needs? I manage a household budget carefully. I didn't feel the need to constantly ask for more. So the answer is no. You never told him it wasn't enough. No, my mother admitted, a note of impatience creeping into her voice. Patricia then walked her, methodically, through Carol's financial findings, the recurring transfers into the joint savings account, the wine club membership, the restaurant delivery pattern. My mother's answers grew shorter and more clipped as the questions went on, her composure fraying at the edges in small, visible ways, a tightening around her mouth, a slight increase in the speed of her speech. I'm allowed to save money, my mother said at one point, her voice rising slightly. I'm allowed to have some of my own. Nobody said every single dollar had to be spent that same month. I'm not asking whether you're allowed to save money in general, Mrs. Whitfield, Patricia said, her voice remaining perfectly level. I'm asking whether the money your son designated specifically for his daughter's food, clothing, and school needs was, in fact, largely deposited into your personal savings account rather than spent on those things. It was for Ava's future, my mother said. I was building a cushion for her. For when she's older. Did you ever tell Daniel that? Did you ever say, I'm not spending all of this on immediate needs, I'm saving some for Ava's future? My mother was quiet for a moment. No, not in those words. In any words? No. Then Patricia moved to the piece of evidence that I believe, more than anything else in those 2 days, is the reason this story ended the way it did. During the discovery process, Patricia's team had subpoenaed records not just from bank accounts but, with appropriate legal authorization, from a cloud backup service linked to my mother's phone. A service, it turned out, my mother had signed up for years earlier and never fully understood how to disable, meaning years of text messages, including ones she likely believed had been deleted, remained recoverable. Among them was a lengthy text exchange with her sister, my Aunt Diane, spanning the period Ava lived in her house. Patricia asked the judge for permission to read from the exhibit, which had already been entered into evidence and reviewed by both attorneys beforehand. Judge Yamamoto granted it. Patricia read the messages aloud, dated, one at a time, in a flat, even voice that let the words themselves do whatever work they were going to do. March 14th, from you to your sister. Daniel's contribution came in today, putting $300 into savings again, keeping $100 for groceries. At this rate, we'll have a nice little cushion by the time she's a teenager and actually needs real things. I watched my mother's face at this moment. I watched the color drain from it in a way I have genuinely never seen happen to a person's face in real time before. Not gradually, but almost all at once, like a light switching off. Patricia continued. May 2nd. Honestly, it's less work than I expected once I stopped fussing over every little thing. She doesn't complain much. Easier kid than Daniel or Rachel ever were, believe it or not. September 9th. Skipped her checkup again this year. Didn't feel like dealing with the scheduling and the waiting room with a 9-year-old. She's fine. Kids are resilient. November 22nd. Told the school she has a coat. She does. She just doesn't like the color. Kids are dramatic about the silliest things, not making a special trip to buy another one over that. Each message landed in that courtroom like a small, precise blow. I watched Judge Yamamoto's face during this reading, and I want to describe it carefully, because it is the moment I will remember most clearly for the rest of my life. She did not react with visible shock or anger. Her expression instead went very still, very focused, the way a person's face looks when they are committing something to memory with total, deliberate attention, which, I would understand a few minutes later, was exactly what she was doing. When Patricia finished reading, she turned back to my mother, who was sitting very upright, very rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mrs. Whitfield, Patricia said, do you recognize these messages as your own? My mother's voice, when it finally came, was smaller than I had ever heard it. I don't remember writing those exact words. But you don't deny sending them? My mother stopped. She looked for the first time in the entire proceeding at Gregory, as though hoping he might rescue her. But there was nothing he could do from where he sat. I was venting to my sister. People vent. That doesn't mean... Mrs. Whitfield, Judge Yamamoto interjected, speaking for the first time in a long while, her voice quiet but carrying easily through the courtroom. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd like you to answer it as precisely as you can. In the message dated November 22nd, you wrote that you told the school your granddaughter had a coat, when in fact she either did not have one, or was, by your own account, refusing to wear the one she had. Which was it? My mother opened her mouth, closed it, and then said, very quietly, she didn't have one that fit anymore. I hadn't gotten around to replacing it yet. So the statement you gave the school, that she had a coat and simply didn't like the color, was untrue. I didn't think it was a big deal at the time. It was 22 degrees outside, Judge Yamamoto said, still in that same quiet, level voice, the voice of someone reading a fact off a page rather than passing judgment. According to the school nurse's records, which are also in evidence, your granddaughter was cold enough that the nurse provided her with a spare coat from the school's emergency supply, kept specifically for children who arrive without adequate winter clothing. Is that consistent with your understanding of the day? I didn't know it got that involved, my mother said. I didn't know the nurse had to get involved. You didn't know, Judge Yamamoto repeated, and something in the careful neutrality of her repetition made it land harder than any accusation could have. Mrs. Whitfield, in the message dated September 9th, you wrote that you skipped a scheduled checkup because you, quote, didn't feel like dealing with the scheduling and the waiting room. Is that an accurate description of your reasoning at the time? My mother's composure finally, fully broke. I watched her hands begin to shake in her lap. I don't remember exactly what I was thinking. It was a hard year. Everyone was tired. I understand that caregiving is exhausting, Judge Yamamoto said, and for just a moment something almost gentle moved across her face, though it didn't stay there long. I have presided over many custody cases involving grandparents who took on more than they had the resources or the health to manage, and who did their genuine best within real limitations, and I have enormous compassion for those families. What concerns me here, Mrs. Whitfield, is not that you were tired. It's that the record shows a pattern of choices, not limitations. Choices. I remember hearing, very clearly, the sound of the air conditioning cycling on somewhere above us, because there was no other sound at all. My mother did not answer. She sat very still, staring at a point somewhere on the table in front of her, and I understood, watching her, that she had finally run out of the explanations that had carried her through 36 years of my life and 3 years of Ava's. The small justifications, the shifting of blame, the conviction that whatever she decided must, by virtue of being her decision, be reasonable. There was no explanation left that could survive being read back to her, dated and, in her own words, in a courtroom, by a judge who had clearly read every single page of the file before either attorney said a word. My father testified after my mother, and I want to describe his testimony separately, because it revealed something different. Not calculation, exactly, but a particular kind of passive complicity that I think is worth understanding on its own terms, because I suspect it is far more common than the more active version my mother displayed. My father was 70 years old, a man who had spent his entire working life following instructions precisely and taking pride in never being the one who caused a problem. On the stand, he was soft-spoken, almost apologetic in his demeanor, a marked contrast to my mother's rigid composure. When Patricia asked him whether he had known about the lunches, he said, "I knew Linda handled that. I didn't get too involved in the day-to-day. That was always more her department." Did you ever look inside Ava's lunchbox before she left for school? No, I can't say that I did. Did you know she'd stopped eating lunch at school for several weeks? Linda mentioned something about it. I figured it would sort itself out. Did you ever ask Ava directly how she was doing? Whether she had what she needed? My father was quiet for a moment. I suppose I didn't think it was my place to ask those kinds of questions. Linda always handled the emotional side of things. I mowed the lawn. I fixed things around the house. I made sure the bills got paid. Mr. Whitfield, Patricia said, did you know that Ava hadn't seen a doctor in over 2 years? I knew Linda hadn't scheduled anything in a while. I assumed she had her reasons. Did you ever ask what those reasons were? No, my father admitted. I didn't. I want to be honest about something. Watching my father testify was, in some ways, more painful for me than watching my mother's cross-examination, even though my mother's conduct was clearly the more active and more damaging force in Ava's daily life. My father's testimony revealed a man who had, for 3 years, watched his granddaughter fade in front of him and had told himself, again and again, that it wasn't his department to notice, that emotional and physical care of a child was Linda's department, the way laundry or grocery shopping might be someone's department in an ordinary household division of labor. Judge Yamamoto asked him one question that I have thought about many times since. Mr. Whitfield, you testified that you didn't consider it your place to ask your granddaughter whether she had what she needed. Can you tell me whose place you believe that was, if not a caregiving grandparent living in the same house as a 9-year-old child? My father sat with that question for what felt like a very long time. "I suppose," he finally said. "I thought someone else was handling it. I didn't think it through much further than that." "That's the concern the court has to weigh," Judge Yamamoto said, not unkindly, but with a clarity that left no room for softening. A child in that home needed two attentive adults, and instead, she appears to have had one adult actively deprioritizing her needs, and a second adult who simply declined to look closely enough to notice. "I don't think my father is, or was, a cruel man in the way my mother's texts revealed something closer to genuine calculation. I think my father is a man who spent his whole life believing that as long as he wasn't the one causing the problem, he bore no responsibility for failing to stop it. A belief that, I have come to understand, does its own kind of quiet damage because a child cannot tell the difference, in any meaningful sense, between a grandparent who withholds care deliberately and one who simply never bothers to notice it's missing." Closing arguments came at the end of the second day, after a short recess that Patricia later told me she suspected Judge Yamamoto had called specifically to give both sides, and perhaps herself, a moment to absorb what had just happened during my mother's cross-examination. Gregory Halloran's closing was, I'll admit, more measured than I expected given what had just occurred. He didn't try to relitigate the text messages or pretend they hadn't happened. Instead, he pivoted to an argument about proportion and remedy. "Your Honor," he said, "no one is disputing that mistakes were made. No one is disputing that Mrs. Whitfield's private communications reflect poorly on her judgment during a genuinely difficult period of her life. But the question before this court is not whether my clients are perfect. The question is, what arrangement serves this child's best interests going forward? My clients are not asking to reclaim custody. They are asking this court not to sever their relationship with their granddaughter entirely, which is what the petitioner is effectively requesting through the restrictive visitation terms proposed in his filing. A flawed grandparent is not the same as a dangerous one, and this court has an obligation to weigh the value of extended family relationships against the undeniable but non-violent shortcomings revealed in this testimony. I remember feeling a flicker of anxiety at this argument, because it was, in its narrow way, a reasonable one. The law does generally favor maintaining family relationships where possible, and Gregory was smart to steer away from defending the indefensible and toward a more modest ask. Patricia's closing addressed this directly. She began by acknowledging that no one in this courtroom was asking the court to punish my parents in some abstract moral sense, and that the question, as Gregory said, was indeed about Ava's best interests going forward. But she argued that the pattern established over the 2 days of testimony was not a story about isolated lapses in an otherwise adequate home. It was a story about a caregiver who had, by her own written words, made a series of conscious, repeated choices to prioritize her own financial cushion and her own convenience over a grieving child's basic needs, and who had then misrepresented those choices, to the school and to the child's own father, in order to avoid consequences. "Your Honor," Patricia said, "the petitioner is not asking this court to erase Ava's relationship with her grandparents. He is asking this court to ensure that any future contact occurs under conditions that protect her, supervised initially, gradually expanded only if and when trust can be rebuilt, and always secondary to her primary home with her father, who has demonstrated in every action he has taken since learning the truth that he will put his daughter's needs above his own convenience, above his own comfort, and above his own relationship with his parents. That is the standard this child deserves. It is the only standard any child deserves." She closed by returning deliberately to the letter Ava had written months earlier, the one about not being scared of being a bother anymore. "Your Honor has heard testimony from a teacher who watched this child go hungry rather than draw attention to herself. You have heard from a forensic accountant who traced money designated for this child's care into a savings account instead. You have heard, in the grandmother's own words, read back to her from messages she likely believed no one would ever see, a candid account of choices made and covered up. But I would ask the court to weigh all of that against the simplest piece of evidence in this entire case. A 9-year-old girl, in her own handwriting, describing what safety feels like to her for the first time since her mother died. That is what this court is being asked to protect. Nothing more complicated than that. Judge Yamamoto did not rule from the bench that day. She told both parties she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written decision within 30 days, which Patricia told us was standard for a case with this much documentary evidence to weigh, though the weight was, for all of us, close to unbearable. I want to tell you about those 30 days honestly, because they were not peaceful. Daniel oscillated between cautious hope and a kind of dread he couldn't quite shake, worried that Gregory's closing argument about proportion and family preservation might carry more weight with the judge than we hoped. Ava, for her part, seemed to sense the tension in the house without fully understanding its source, and Daniel told me she'd started asking, at bedtime, whether she was going to have to go back to Grandma and Grandpa's house, a question he answered honestly each time, that he didn't know for certain yet, but that whatever happened, he was not going to let her be unsafe or unhappy again. I checked my phone obsessively during that month, the way you check a wound to see if it's healing, and on a Thursday afternoon in mid-July, Patricia called. "The ruling came in," she said. "Do you want me to read you the summary, or do you want to come by the office?" I told her to read it to me. I remember exactly where I was standing. In my kitchen, one hand braced against the counter, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my throat. Judge Yamamoto's written decision, which ran to 23 pages, granted Daniel sole legal and physical custody of Ava, formalizing the arrangement that had existed informally since March. It found, in the court's own language, that the evidence overwhelmingly establishes a sustained pattern of neglect, characterized not by an absence of resources, but by a repeated prioritization of the caregiver's own financial and personal comfort over the minor child's documented needs, compounded by deliberate misrepresentations to the child's school and to her legal guardian regarding the nature and adequacy of her care. On the question of visitation, the court did not sever the relationship entirely. Gregory had been right that Ohio family courts are generally reluctant to do that, absent evidence of physical danger, but it imposed conditions that were far more restrictive than my parents had hoped for. Visitation with my parents was to be supervised for a minimum of 1 year, at a frequency and duration to be determined by Daniel in consultation with Ava's therapist, whom the court also ordered Ava to begin seeing regularly, with costs to be split between Daniel and my parents given their documented ability to pay. The court further ordered that any future unsupervised contact would require a formal petition demonstrating meaningful, sustained change, evaluated no sooner than 12 months from the date of the ruling. And then there was one more provision, one that Patricia told me she had specifically requested but had not been confident the court would grant: restitution. The court ordered my parents to return, in full, the $16,211 Carol Ibarra had traced into their personal savings account, to be placed instead into a custodial account in Ava's name, to be used for her education, her medical needs, or other expenses at her father's discretion until she turned 18. I sat in my kitchen and cried when Patricia finished reading, and I want to be honest that the tears were complicated. Relief, mostly. An enormous flood of relief that Ava was safe, and that the court had seen, clearly and precisely, exactly what had happened in that house. But there was grief tangled in it too, a grief I hadn't fully let myself feel until that exact moment, for the family I had believed I had for 36 years, and the family that, In the space of a single legal decision, I now understood I had actually never had it all. I called Daniel immediately. He didn't say anything for a long moment when I told him, and then he said, in a voice thick with something between relief and exhaustion, "She's safe. She's actually, legally, permanently safe. I don't have to be scared of losing her to them anymore." That night, Daniel told me later, he sat with Ava on the back steps of his house, and she asked him what had happened with the court thing. And he told her, in language a 9-year-old could hold on to, that the judge had decided she was going to keep living with him, that Grandma and Grandpa would still get to see her sometimes, but with someone else there to make sure everyone was doing okay, and that nobody was ever going to make her feel like a bother again. Ava, he said, was quiet for a moment, and then she asked, "Does this mean I don't have to be scared anymore?" "No, baby," Daniel told her. "You don't have to be scared anymore." I would like to be able to tell you that the ruling shocked my parents into some kind of genuine reckoning, that reading a judge's 23-page finding of sustained neglect, in language as clear and unambiguous as any legal document I have ever seen, cracked something open in them and led to real change. I would like to tell you that. It would make for a tidier ending. It is not, however, entirely what happened, and I think the truth is more useful, even if it's less satisfying. My father, in the weeks after the ruling, seemed genuinely shaken. He called Daniel, not me, which I understood, given how things had gone between my mother and me, and asked, haltingly, whether there was anything he could do, whether he could see Ava under whatever conditions the court required, whether Daniel would tell him honestly what he'd need to do to rebuild some kind of trust. Daniel told me later that it was the first time in his adult life he'd heard our father sound uncertain about anything, and that uncertainty, strange as it sounds, felt like the first honest thing my father had offered in this entire ordeal. My mother's response was different, and I want to describe it carefully, because I think it illustrates something important about how people who have spent a lifetime avoiding accountability often respond when accountability finally, unavoidably, arrives. For the first several weeks after the ruling, she was, according to what Aunt Diane later told me, because my mother still was not speaking to me directly, furious. Not ashamed, not reflective, but furious in the specific way a person is furious when they feel they have been humiliated rather than corrected. She apparently told several people in Millbrook that the court had been manipulated by a slick city lawyer, and that Daniel had turned the whole family against her over what she continued to characterize as misunderstandings and things said in private that were taken out of context. I heard secondhand that she complained to her book club about the restitution order specifically, describing it as theft, essentially, legalized theft of money I earned raising that child, a framing so completely disconnected from the actual facts of the case. Money designated by Ava's father for Ava's care, diverted into personal savings, now ordered returned to Ava, that I genuinely did not know, when I heard it, whether to laugh or cry. I did neither. I mostly just felt tired, the specific exhaustion of understanding that some people will construct almost any narrative necessary to avoid sitting with the plain, unflattering truth of their own choices. It took nearly 4 months before my mother reached out to me directly. When she did, it was a text message, not a call, which I think tells you something about how much distance she needed to say what she said. "I've been doing some thinking," the message read. "I know things were said in court that made me look terrible. I want you to know I never meant to hurt Ava. I just handled things my own way, and maybe that wasn't right for her specifically. I'd like to see you and the kids sometime, if you're willing." I sat with that message for a long time before responding. I want to be honest that some part of me, the part of me that had spent 36 years wanting my mother's approval, wanting things to be easy between us, wanted desperately to accept it at face value, to treat Maybe that wasn't right for her specifically, as the beginning of real change. But I had spent the better part of a year learning to look at things clearly instead of the way I wanted them to be, and I could see, reading that message several times, that there was still no actual acknowledgement in it. Not of the lunches, not of the missed doctor's visits, not of the money, not of the deliberate lie to the school about the coat. There was only a vague, deflecting reference to things said in court and handling things my own way. Language engineered to accept just enough responsibility to reopen a door without ever actually walking back through the specific things she'd done. I responded, eventually, with something close to this. I love you, Mom, and I don't want to be estranged from you forever. But I need you to actually say clearly what you did wrong, not that things were said, not that you handled things your own way, but that you took money meant for Ava's food and put it in your savings account, that you told her school she had a coat when she didn't, that you let 2 years go by without a single doctor's visit. If you can say those things and mean them, I think we can figure out a path forward. If you can't, I don't think I can pretend this didn't happen just to make things comfortable again. She did not respond to that message for almost 3 weeks. When she finally did, it was 3 sentences long. I did what I thought was best at the time. I'm sorry it hurt everyone so much. I hope we can move past this eventually. I read that message standing in my kitchen, in almost the exact spot where I had once stood holding my son's t-shirts, listening to Daniel describe a 9-year-old girl too ashamed to eat her lunch. I felt, reading it, a strange kind of clarity, not anger exactly, though there was some of that too, but a settled, quiet understanding that my mother was not, at least not yet, capable of the kind of honest accounting that would make real reconciliation possible. I did what I thought was best is not an apology. It is a defense dressed up in apologetic punctuation. I did not respond to that message at all, not out of cruelty, but because I had nothing productive left to say to it. And I had learned, over the previous year, that some conversations only continue the same argument in a different shape, and that sometimes the healthiest thing to do is simply stop having them until the other person is ready to have a different one. I want to spend some time now on the part of this story that matters more than any courtroom, more than any bank statement, more than any text message read aloud by an attorney, Ava herself, and what the year following the ruling actually looked like for her. Daniel enrolled her, per the court's order and his own conviction that she needed it regardless of any order, with a child psychologist named Dr. Renata Bloom, who specialized in grief and attachment work with children who had experienced parental loss combined with subsequent caregiving instability. A specific enough combination, I learned, that finding the right fit took a few tries. But Dr. Bloom turned out to be exactly right. Daniel told me, in one of our long phone calls during that first year, that the early sessions revealed things that broke his heart in ways even the custody hearing hadn't fully prepared him for. Ava, it turned out, had developed a habit. Dr. Blum called it a hypervigilance pattern, common in children who've learned that their needs are a burden, of preemptively minimizing anything she wanted or needed before anyone else could reject it. She would say, "I'm not that hungry," before anyone asked whether she wanted a snack. She would say, "It's fine. I don't really need it," about torn clothes, broken school supplies, small things a typical 9-year-old would ask to have replaced without a second thought. Dr. Bloom explained to Daniel that this wasn't modesty or maturity, as it might look on the surface. It was a defense mechanism a child develops when she's learned that asking for things risks being met with irritation or dismissal, so the safest strategy becomes not asking at all. It took months of consistent, patient reassurance, Daniel telling her, again and again in small moments, that she was allowed to want things, that asking for a snack or a new pair of shoes was not an imposition, that he wanted to know if something was wrong rather than finding out 3 weeks later that she'd been quietly suffering through it. Before Ava began, slowly, to unlearn that pattern. Dr. Bloom told Daniel this kind of unlearning takes time precisely because it isn't really about the specific requests. It's about a child rebuilding, from the ground up, a basic sense that her needs matter to the people responsible for her. I saw this shift happen in small, specific moments over that first year, in ways that moved me more than almost anything else in this entire story. I remember a Thanksgiving, about 5 months after the ruling, when Ava, sitting at my dining table with my own children, who adored her, asked, out loud, unprompted, whether there was more mashed potatoes, because she wanted seconds. It was such a small, ordinary thing. Any child at any dinner table says some version of that sentence 1,000 times over a childhood. But I watched Daniel's face when she said it, and I understood, from his expression, that this was a milestone he had been quietly waiting for. His daughter, at a family dinner, simply asking for more food because she wanted it, without any performance of not wanting to be a bother. She started, over that year, keeping a diary that Dr. Blum had suggested as part of their work together, and Daniel showed me an entry once, with Ava's permission, that I think captures something important about how a child's understanding of what happened to her evolves over time. She had written in the careful, slightly uneven handwriting of a fourth grader, "I used to think it was my fault that Grandma got tired of me. Dr. Blum says that's not true. Kids don't make grown-ups tired just by existing, and grown-ups are supposed to take care of kids even when they're tired. I still miss my mom every single day, but I don't miss being at Grandma's house. I like it at Dad's house because I don't have to guess if today is a day I'm allowed to ask for things." I have read that entry more times than I can count, and every time I feel the same combination of grief and gratitude. Grief for the version of my niece who spent 3 years learning to guess whether today was a day she was allowed to ask for things, and gratitude that she had a father, and by extension an aunt, willing to spend a year of legal battles and financial forensics and painful family estrangement to make sure she never had to guess again. Daniel's work situation also changed, in a way I think matters to this story, because it addresses the practical question that had made the original arrangement with our parents seem necessary in the first place. In the months following the custody hearing, he negotiated with his employer for a shift to a regional territory that reduced his overnight travel from several nights a week to, at most, 1 or 2 nights a month, accepting a modest pay reduction in exchange. He also arranged reliable after-school care through a program at Ava's school, supplemented by a retired neighbor, Mrs. Castellano, who had 2 grandchildren of her own nearby, and was delighted to add Ava to her after-school routine for a modest fee Daniel insisted on paying despite her initial protests. It was, he told me once, a far less comfortable arrangement financially than the one our parents had offered. Less money in savings, a smaller house, fewer conveniences, but it was an arrangement built on something our parents' offer had never actually contained, which was a genuine, uncomplicated prioritization of Ava's well-being over anyone's comfort, including his own. The court-ordered supervised visitation began about 6 weeks after the ruling, coordinated through a family services agency that provided a neutral supervisor. A calm, unflappable woman named Ms. Patterson, who had spent over a decade facilitating exactly this kind of fraught reunification and knew how to keep a room from tipping into chaos. I want to describe the first visit, because Daniel told me about it in detail afterward, and because I think it illustrates the different paths my parents were on even in that very first supervised hour. My father arrived early, sitting quietly in the waiting area of the agency's visitation center, and when Ava came in with Daniel, he stood up immediately, and Daniel said his hands were visibly shaking. He didn't try to hug her right away, Dr. Blum had coached Daniel to remind Ava that she got to decide how much physical affection she wanted to offer, and Ava, after a moment of hesitation, walked over and gave her grandfather a brief, careful hug, which he accepted with what Daniel described as an expression of profound, almost desperate gratitude. "I'm glad to see you, sweetheart," my father said. "I've missed you." "I missed you too, Grandpa," Ava said. And Daniel told me this was true, that whatever else had happened in that house, Ava's feelings toward her grandfather were more straightforwardly warm than her feelings toward my mother, perhaps because his failures, while serious, had been failures of passive absence rather than active minimization. My mother's arrival, 20 minutes later, she came separately, which Ms. Patterson had actually recommended, given the tension, was different. Daniel described her as composed, overly composed, performing a kind of bright, determined cheerfulness that read, even to a 9-year-old, as slightly forced. "There's my girl," my mother said, reaching for a hug that Ava allowed but did not fully lean into. "Don't you look wonderful? Are you being good for your dad?" Daniel told me that single question. "Are you being good for your dad?" landed on him like a small, precise gut punch, because it was such an unconscious continuation of the exact dynamic that had caused so much damage. The assumption, embedded so deep it emerged even in a reunion visit designed to demonstrate change, that the burden of good behavior sat on the child, that Ava's worthiness of affection was contingent on her being good, rather than simply being loved as she was. Over the following months, the supervised visits settled into a pattern that Ms. Patterson documented carefully for the court, per the terms of the ruling, and that Daniel and I discussed at length in our own phone calls. My father used the visits, consistently, to ask Ava about her actual life, her friends at school, a book she was reading, a soccer team she'd joined that spring, and to listen to her answers without steering the conversation back toward himself or toward defending the past. He apologized to her directly, once about 4 months into the supervised visits, in a moment Ms. Patterson noted in her report as significant. He told Ava that he was sorry he hadn't paid closer attention to whether she had what she needed while she lived with him and Grandma, that he should have asked more questions, and that he was working on being a better grandfather going forward. He did not qualify it, did not add but, did not turn it into an excuse. He simply said it and let it sit there. My mother's visits followed a different pattern. She brought gifts frequently, new toys, clothes, a bicycle on one occasion that Ms. Patterson noted seemed disproportionate to the supervised hour-long format of the visits, and that Daniel, after consulting with Dr. Blum, gently declined on Ava's behalf, explaining to my mother that Ava had what she needed at home and that what she wanted from these visits was connection, not presence. My mother seemed, according to Ms. Patterson's notes, to struggle with this redirection, returning several times over subsequent visits to gift-giving as her primary mode of engagement, as though she had not fully absorbed, or did not know how to operate without, the substitution of material provision for emotional attunement that had defined her entire approach to caregiving in the first place. She never, in that first year, said the specific words Daniel and I both privately hoped for, a direct acknowledgement to Ava herself of the specific things that had gone wrong, rather than a general, deflecting reference to things being hard during that period. Dr. Blum, when Daniel asked her about this, offered a perspective I found useful, even though it didn't make the waiting any easier. Genuine accountability requires a person to hold two things at once, she said, that they are fundamentally a person worthy of love, and that they did something that caused real harm. A lot of people, when they're confronted with harm they caused, can only manage one side of that at a time. They either collapse into, "I am a terrible person," which paradoxically lets them off the hook, because it centers their own feelings rather than the person they hurt, or they defend, "I am a good person," so vigorously that they can't make room for, and I did something wrong. Real repair requires both halves held together, calmly, without collapsing into either extreme. Some people get there. Some people take years. Some people never get there at all. I can't tell you which one your mother will turn out to be, only that the visits themselves aren't proof of anything yet. They're just the opportunity for it to happen, if it's going to. About 8 months after the ruling, I received a phone call from my father, alone, without my mother's knowledge, which was itself unusual enough that I answered immediately, worried something was wrong. "I wanted to talk to you without your mother around," he said, and I could hear in his voice an uncertainty that had not been there in the man I grew up with. A man who had always projected a quiet, unshakable confidence about the rightness of whatever the household had decided. "I've been going to these visits," he said. "And I've been going to a few sessions with a counselor myself, actually, which I know isn't something I've ever done before, and your mother thinks it's ridiculous. But I wanted to tell you, I understand now, in a way I didn't, during that hearing, how much I failed her. Ava, I mean. I keep going back over those 3 years in my head, and I keep landing on the same thing. I told myself it wasn't my department. I actually used that phrase in my own head, more than once, watching her at the dinner table not really eating much, telling myself, that's Linda's department, I don't need to get involved. And the truth is, Rachel, I don't think I ever once, in 3 years, asked that little girl how she was really doing. Not once. I asked if she was doing well in school. I asked if she liked her teacher. I never once asked if she was okay. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, feeling something complicated move through me. Relief, mostly, that at least one of my parents seemed to be doing the difficult, unglamorous work of actually looking at what happened rather than defending it, but also a grief that ran alongside that relief, because I understood, hearing him say this, how much simpler things might have been if he had asked that single question even once, at any point during those 3 years. "I don't know how to fix what I didn't do," he said. "I know an apology doesn't undo 2 years without a doctor's visit. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what happened. I'm not going to pretend anymore that it was your mother's department, and I was just an innocent bystander in my own house." "Dad," I said, and I found my voice was not entirely steady. "I appreciate you telling me this. I really do. But it's not really me who needs to hear it. It's Ava. And it's Daniel." "I know," he said. "I've told them some of this, in the visits, as much as the format allows. I wanted to tell you too, though, because—" He paused, and I heard something in his voice crack slightly, a rare thing for my father. "Because I don't want to lose you either, Rachel. I know I already came close to losing my relationship with Ava over this, and I understand why, and I accept it, whatever comes of it. But I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between having Ava safe and having a relationship with me. I understand if you need time. I understand if it takes years. I just wanted you to know I'm not defending what happened. Not anymore." I told him I loved him, and that I believed he meant what he was saying, and that I hoped, over time, we could find a way forward that didn't require me to pretend the last several years hadn't happened. He said that was fair. That was more than fair. And we ended the call on better terms than we had been on in nearly a year. I want to be honest that this conversation did not resolve everything, and it certainly did not resolve anything with my mother, who remained, throughout that entire first year, largely unable or unwilling to move past the defensive posture she'd adopted from the moment the lawsuit was filed. But it mattered to me, deeply, that at least one of my parents was doing the work. Not performing remorse for an audience, not managing his reputation, but sitting with a genuinely uncomfortable truth about his own passivity and choosing, slowly, to become a different kind of grandfather because of it. I think, if I'm honest, this is closer to how most family repair actually happens than the dramatic reconciliations you sometimes see in movies. Not a single cathartic apology that fixes everything at once, but a slow, uneven, partial process, where some people do the work and some people don't, where progress on one relationship doesn't guarantee progress on another, and where you have to decide, case by case, person by person, how much trust to extend based on actual, demonstrated change rather than declared intentions. At the 12-month mark specified in Judge Yamamoto's ruling, my parents, through Gregory, filed the petition the court had outlined as the path toward expanded, potentially unsupervised visitation. The formal demonstration of meaningful, sustained change the original order had required. I want to tell you honestly that I did not expect this filing to go well for my mother, and I was right, though not entirely in the way I anticipated. The petition included statements from both my parents, along with a letter from a therapist my mother had, somewhat reluctantly, according to my father, begun seeing about 6 months into that first year. Not the kind of sustained reflective work my father had described undertaking, but a shorter engagement that read, when I saw the filing, more like a box being checked than a genuine process of change. The therapist's letter, which Patricia later described to us as carefully hedged in exactly the way you'd expect from someone writing on behalf of a client who hadn't done much of the actual work, noted that my mother has expressed regret regarding the outcome of the custody proceedings and has engaged in several sessions addressing communication patterns within the family. It did not say she had taken responsibility for the specific conduct described in the court's findings. It did not say she had developed insight into why she had made the choices she made. It was, in Patricia's words, a letter designed to demonstrate participation, not transformation. Ms. Patterson's supervision reports, submitted as part of the same proceeding, painted a more granular picture consistent with what Daniel and I had observed over the year. My father's reports were, across the board, positive, consistent engagement, appropriate attunement to Ava's cues, a demonstrated ability to sit with difficult topics without deflecting. My mother's reports were mixed. There had been real improvement. She had, over the year, largely stopped the excessive gift-giving Dr. Blum had flagged as a substitute for genuine connection, and she had, on a handful of occasions, asked Ava open-ended questions about her feelings rather than steering every conversation toward cheerful, surface-level topics. But Ms. Patterson also noted, in careful, clinical language, that my mother had not, in observed sessions, directly acknowledged specific past conduct with the minor child, instead offering general statements about wanting to do better going forward. Judge Yamamoto's ruling on the petition, issued about 6 weeks after the filing, granted my father expanded visitation, moving from strictly supervised to a hybrid arrangement with periodic unsupervised time, contingent on continued positive reports over the following 6 months. For my mother, the court maintained the supervised requirement in full, writing in her decision that, while the court acknowledges some observed improvement in the mother's engagement during supervised visits, the record does not yet demonstrate the kind of direct, specific accountability that would support removing the protective structure currently in place. The court remains concerned that Mrs. Whitfield's public statements outside these proceedings, as documented in witness testimony, continue to characterize the underlying conduct as misunderstood rather than harmful, which raises ongoing concern about her capacity for the kind of honest self-assessment necessary to ensure this pattern does not recur. I remember reading that ruling and feeling, for the first time in this entire process, something close to a settled peace rather than anxious vigilance. Not because my mother had been punished. Patricia was always careful to remind us that this was never the goal, that family court exists to protect children, not to exact retribution on adults, but because the court's ongoing, careful attention meant that Ava's safety did not depend on anyone simply trusting that my mother had changed. It depended on demonstrated evidence, reviewed regularly, by a neutral party with the authority and expertise to actually assess it. My mother, according to Aunt Diane, was devastated by the continued restriction and expressed, again, more frustration at the process than reflection on what had produced it. I found myself, hearing this, less angry than I might have expected, and more simply resigned to the reality that some people take a very long time to change, if they ever do, and that I could not control the timeline of my mother's growth, only my own boundaries around it. I'm writing the rest of this account roughly 2 years after the original custody ruling, and I want to tell you where things stand now, because I think endings that are too neat do a disservice to how these situations actually resolve in real life, which is rarely all the way to either happily ever after or permanent estrangement, but somewhere messier and more specific in between. Ava is 11 now, in 6th grade, and by every account I have, from Daniel, from her teachers, from my own observations at family gatherings, she is doing remarkably well. She plays travel soccer, a sport she discovered the spring after the custody ruling, and took to with an intensity that Daniel says reminds him powerfully of Melissa, who was, apparently, similarly fierce about the sports she loved as a kid. She has a close group of friends. She still sees Dr. Bloom, though the sessions have moved from weekly to monthly, as the acute hypervigilance patterns have continued to soften. She still misses her mother. Daniel says this comes in waves, sometimes triggered by something as small as a song on the radio or a smell in a grocery store, and that he's learned to simply sit with her in those moments, rather than trying to fix or rush through the grief. But she is, by any reasonable measure, a thriving, secure, well-cared-for child, which is the outcome that mattered more than anything else in this entire story. My father's relationship with Ava has continued to deepen. He has full unsupervised visitation now, granted at the 18-month mark after another positive review, and he has become, according to Daniel, an almost unrecognizable version of the grandfather he was during Ava's years in that house. He asks about her soccer games and actually attends several a season. He calls just to check in, rather than only during scheduled visits. And he has, on more than one occasion, told Daniel directly that he is grateful, in a strange and painful way, that the truth came out when it did, because it forced him to become a different kind of father and grandfather than he had spent his whole life being. My mother's situation is more complicated, and I want to be honest that it has not resolved the way I once hoped it might. She remains under a supervised visitation arrangement, now voluntary on both sides, rather than court-mandated, since the formal order expired at the 2-year mark. Daniel offered her the option of unsupervised time at that point, cautiously, based on continued gradual improvement Ms. Patterson had documented, but my mother, notably, has continued to request that Ms. Patterson, or, more recently, a mutually agreed-upon family friend, remain present for visits, which Daniel and I both interpreted, with some surprise, as possibly the most meaningful sign of change we've seen from her. An acknowledgement, even if never spoken directly, that she does not yet fully trust her own judgment unsupervised, and that she would rather maintain a structure that protects Ava than assert a right to unrestricted access she isn't certain she's earned. She has still never said, to my knowledge, the specific sentence Daniel and I once hoped for. I took the money you gave me for Ava's food and put it in my own savings account. I lied to her school about the coat. I let 2 years go by without a doctor's visit, and I am sorry for each of those specific things. What she has said more recently, in a conversation with Daniel that he relayed to me almost word for word because it moved him more than he expected, is this: I don't think I understood back then how much what I did every single day added up to something so much bigger than any one of those days felt like on its own. I keep thinking I'll wake up one morning and finally feel like I've said sorry enough, and I don't think that morning is going to come, because I don't think there's an amount of sorry that undoes what she went through. I just want you to know I see that now, even if I can't undo it. It is not everything. It is not the full, itemized accountability I once thought was the only acceptable outcome. But it is, Dr. Blum told Daniel when he described it to her. A genuine articulation of remorse that holds both halves at once, that she was, and perhaps still is, a person capable of love, and that she caused real, specific, lasting harm, which is further than a great many people in her position ever managed to travel. I have chosen, for now, to let that be enough to maintain a limited, cautious relationship with my mother, one built on continued demonstrated behavior rather than declared feeling, while reserving the right to pull back further if that behavior ever slips. I've told this story now the way I lived it, slowly, with a great deal of denial at the start, and a great deal of uncomfortable clarity by the end. I want to close with a few things I would tell anyone who finds themselves noticing the small, easy to explain away signs I noticed for far too long before I finally acted. First, trust the discomfort, not the explanation. My mother had an explanation for everything, every missed appointment, every thin lunch, every excuse about a coat that didn't fit. Explanations are cheap, patterns are not. If you find yourself accepting the same kind of explanation over and over for the same kind of concerning behavior, the pattern is the truth, and the explanation is just the sound a person makes while avoiding it. Second, document things while you're still unsure, not after you're certain. I wish I had started keeping notes the very first time something felt off, rather than waiting until Daniel's phone call about the lunches finally broke through my own denial. Ms. Okafor's dated folder mattered enormously in that courtroom precisely because it was contemporaneous, built in real time rather than reconstructed from memory after the fact. If something feels wrong, write down the date and what happened, even if you're not sure yet whether it means anything. You can always decide later that it didn't matter. You cannot go back in time and create documentation you didn't keep. Third, involve people with no stake in the family dynamic. Ms. Okafor's testimony carried the weight it did precisely because she had nothing to gain from telling the truth and no personal history clouding her observations. If you're worried about a child in a family situation, the school, the pediatrician, and, where genuinely warranted, child protective services exist because family members are often too entangled in loyalty, guilt, and history to see clearly or to be believed when they do. Fourth, and this is the hardest one, be prepared for people you love to choose their own comfort over the truth, and do not let their choice stop you from doing what's right. I lost for a time my relationship with my mother, and I came close to losing my aunt entirely, over insisting on a truth that inconvenienced people who preferred a quieter story. I do not regret it, not for one single day, even during the hardest parts of that year. Ava's safety was never contingent on my family's comfort with the truth, and I have come to believe that this is true in every situation like this one. A child's well-being does not owe deference to an adult's reputation. And finally, change is possible, but it is slow, uneven, and never guaranteed, and you are allowed to require evidence of it rather than simply accepting declarations of it. My father changed meaningfully because he did the difficult, private work of actually confronting what he had failed to do. My mother has changed some, more slowly, more incompletely, and I have adjusted my trust in her accordingly, in careful proportion to what she has actually demonstrated rather than what she has merely said. Ava is safe now. She is loved visibly and consistently, by a father who reorganized his entire working life around her well-being, and increasingly, by a grandfather who finally understood, at 70 years old, that "not my department" is not an acceptable answer when a child in your own home is quietly going without. That is the outcome that matters most in this entire story. Everything else, the lawsuits, the forensic accountants, the text messages read aloud in a quiet courtroom, the slow, uneven work of family repair that continues even now, was simply the price of getting there. I paid it gladly. I would pay it again. I want to tell you about one more specific afternoon before I close this out, because I think it captures, better than any summary I could write, exactly how far things had come and exactly how far they still had left to go. Ava's 11th birthday fell on a Saturday in late spring, about 2 years and 3 months after the original custody ruling, and Daniel decided, for the first time since everything had happened, to host a combined family gathering, not a formal reconciliation, nothing announced with any fanfare, just a backyard cookout with cousins, a few of Ava's friends from soccer, my kids, Daniel's coworker and his family, and, cautiously, both of our parents, invited separately, arriving at different times the way the supervised visitation schedule had trained all of us to expect by then, even though this particular gathering wasn't technically a supervised visit. I remember standing in Daniel's kitchen that morning, helping him frost a cake shaped like a soccer ball, and asking him if he was sure about this. "I'm not sure about anything," he said. But Ava asked if Grandpa could come, and when I asked how she felt about Grandma coming too, she thought about it for a second and said, "Yeah, I want her there. I just want someone to make sure it's a good day for everyone." She's 11 years old and she's already better at managing this than most adults I know. My father arrived first, carrying a gift he'd clearly put real thought into. A soccer-themed scrapbook he'd apparently been quietly assembling for months, filled with photos from every game he'd attended since the expanded visitation began, along with ticket stubs and a few handwritten notes about specific goals or plays he remembered. Ava's face, when she opened it, was the kind of unguarded, delighted expression Daniel told me later he still sometimes worried he'd never get to see from her, a remnant of how careful and controlled her expressions used to be during the years she lived with our parents. My mother arrived about 40 minutes later, and I watched her, from across the yard, pause at the gate for a moment before coming in, the way you pause before stepping into water you're not sure is warm enough. She had brought a gift, too. Not a lavish one this time, I noticed, which felt significant given everything Ms. Patterson's reports had documented about her old habit of substituting presents for presents. It was a small, framed photograph of Melissa holding baby Ava in the hospital, a photo I hadn't known my mother even had, restored and printed from what she said was an old phone backup she'd finally gotten around to going through. "I thought you might want this," she told Ava, a little uncertainly, handing it over. "For your room, so you can see her whenever you want." Ava looked at the photograph for a long moment, and then she looked up at my mother, and she said something that I watched land on my mother's face with visible, unguarded impact. "Thank you, Grandma. This is really nice. Can we put it up together after cake?" It was such a small thing, an 11-year-old inviting her grandmother to help hang a picture frame, and yet I watched my mother's eyes fill with tears she clearly hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to manage in front of a yard full of people. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and then she said, "I'd like that very much." And the two of them spent about 10 minutes later that afternoon, off to the side of the party, hanging that photograph in Ava's room together, adjusting it twice to get it level. Ava directing with the confident bossiness of an 11-year-old who has fully recovered her right to have opinions about things. I don't want to oversell this moment. It was not a magic fix. It did not erase 2 years without a doctor's visit or a bank account quietly fattened on money meant for a grieving child's lunches. My mother still has not said, in so many words, every specific thing she did wrong, and I don't know if she ever fully will. But watching her hang that photograph, watching her cry quietly in a child's bedroom over a small kindness she'd finally managed to offer without an ulterior motive attached to it, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself believe until that exact afternoon: that people can change in fragments, unevenly, slower than anyone watching them would like, and that those fragments, small as they are, still matter to the child receiving them, even when the larger reckoning remains incomplete. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone home and it was just Daniel, Ava, my family, and my parents, finishing off the last of the cake on the back porch, I found myself sitting next to my mother for the first time in longer than I could remember, in a silence that wasn't entirely comfortable, but also wasn't the brittle, defensive silence that had characterized every interaction between us for nearly 2 years. "She's a good kid," my mother said quietly, watching Ava laugh at something my son had said. "I know I don't get to take much credit for that." "You don't," I said. Not unkindly, just honestly. "But you get to keep showing up now if you want to. That's still something." My mother nodded and didn't say anything else for a while, and I sat there beside her, watching my niece laugh in a backyard full of people who loved her. And I thought about that first Tuesday night, folding laundry, hearing my brother's voice go flat and careful on the phone as he described a bologna sandwich thrown away in shame. I thought about how far we had all come from that phone call, and how far some of us, my mother, most of all, still had left to travel, and I found, sitting there in the fading evening light, that I could hold both of those things at once without either one canceling the other out: grief for what had happened, and gratitude for what had slowly, carefully, imperfectly been rebuilt in its place. People sometimes ask me when they hear pieces of this story whether I regret how it played out: the estrangement, the accountant's fees, the year of legal battles, the family gatherings I sat out. The version of my mother I lost even as a different, more accountable version slowly began to emerge in her place. I don't regret any of it. I regret only the 3 years I spent not looking closely enough. The 3 years I let a comfortable story about my parents stand in for the harder, truer one sitting right in front of me, visible to anyone who was willing to actually look. Ava is safe. She is loved, fiercely and consistently, by a father who rebuilt his entire life around her, by a grandfather who finally learned that "not my department" is a sentence that has no place in raising a child, and, slowly, imperfectly, by a grandmother who is still learning, fragment by fragment, how to be present rather than merely provide. She plays soccer on Saturday mornings and keeps a diary. Dr. Blum helped her start, and asks for seconds at dinner without a flicker of hesitation. The most ordinary thing in the world, the thing that took the longest of anything to rebuild. If you are reading this because some small, easy-to-explain-away detail has been sitting uncomfortably in the back of your mind, a child who seems too quiet, too careful, too willing to say she doesn't need anything, I hope you'll do what I eventually did, instead of what I did for 3 years before that. Look closely. Write it down. Ask the people with no stake in the story what they've noticed. And when the pattern becomes undeniable, act on it. Even if it costs you people you love, even if it takes a courtroom and a judge reading someone's own words back to them before the truth finally lands the way it should have landed the very first time someone tried to say it out loud. Some children learn to be quiet because quiet is safe. It is our job, all of us, to make sure they never have to learn that lesson in the first place. And when we find out too late that they already have, it is our job to spend whatever it costs to teach them something different. Ava is 11 years old now, and she asks for seconds. That, in the end, is the whole story. I want to go back, briefly, to something I skipped over earlier, because I think it matters to anyone who might find themselves needing to do what I did: hire someone like Frank Wisniewski, a stranger, to help document a pattern of harm inside your own family. I had coffee with Frank about a month after the ruling came down, mostly to thank him properly, since our interactions during the actual investigation had been necessarily clipped and professional, focused entirely on the work. I want to tell you something I tell everyone in your position eventually, once the case is closed, he said, stirring his coffee slowly. You're going to spend a long time afterward wondering if you did the right thing, second-guessing whether the cost was worth it, whether you were too aggressive or not aggressive enough. I want to tell you plainly, you weren't too aggressive. If anything, in 20-some years of doing this kind of work, I see far more families err in the other direction, waiting too long, hoping things resolve on their own, giving grandparents or step-parents or whoever it is one more chance, and one more chance, and one more chance, until the child involved has absorbed years of harm that a faster intervention could have prevented. He told me something else that stuck with me, about the specific texture of neglect cases as opposed to abuse cases. Physical abuse leaves marks people can point to. Neglect leaves absences: the doctor's visit that didn't happen, the coat that wasn't bought, the lunch that wasn't packed properly. Absences are much harder to prosecute in the court of public opinion, even within a family, because there's no single dramatic moment anyone can point to and say, "There, that's the crime." It's the accumulation of 1,000 small absences that adds up to real harm, and the accumulation is exactly what makes people like your aunt and your mother's book club friends able to minimize it. Because no single day, taken alone, looks like an emergency. It's only when you lay them end to end, the way we did with the school records and the medical records and the bank statements, that the shape of what actually happened becomes impossible to explain away. I asked him, because I'd wondered about it for months, whether he had ever worked a case where the grandparents turned out to be innocent, where a family member's suspicions, as strong as mine had been, turned out to be an overreaction to ordinary struggle rather than genuine neglect. More than you'd think, he said. I've had cases where I went in expecting to find exactly what you found, and instead found grandparents doing the absolute best they could with real physical limitations, real financial strain, and a child who was, on the whole, loved and reasonably well cared for despite some rough edges. In those cases, my report reflects that, honestly, and the family usually finds a way to get that struggling caregiver some actual support, respite care, financial assistance, whatever's needed, rather than pursuing a legal battle that wasn't warranted. That's part of why this kind of documentation matters so much. It protects children from real neglect, but it also protects families from tearing themselves apart over misunderstandings, because it forces everyone to look at facts instead of fear or grudges or old family resentments dressed up as concern. But that's not what you found with us, I said. No, Frank said. What I found with you was a household with more than adequate financial resources, choosing, repeatedly, to direct those resources toward personal comfort while a child's basic needs went unmet, and then actively misrepresenting that reality to the people responsible for checking on her. That's a different category of thing entirely. I've seen it more times than I'd like in this line of work. Caregivers who genuinely believe, because they've told themselves the story so many times, that their choices are reasonable, when an outside observer with no emotional investment can see immediately that they aren't. Your mother, from what I could tell in my time investigating this, believed her own explanations completely. That's actually more common than you'd think, and in some ways more dangerous, because a person who knows they're lying at least has some internal alarm bell still functioning. A person who's convinced themselves the lie is true has switched that alarm bell off entirely. I think about that conversation often because it helped me hold two things that I had struggled to hold together throughout the entire ordeal: that my mother was capable of real, if limited, love for Ava, and that she was also capable of the specific, sustained self-deception required to prioritize a savings account over a child's coat for 2 winters running, while genuinely believing the whole time that she was doing an adequate job. I mentioned earlier that my mother's brother, Uncle Paul, offered to testify, and that Patricia eventually took a supplementary statement from him, though she'd cautioned us that his testimony, being impressionistic rather than documentary, would carry less weight on its own than the harder evidence. I want to include what he actually said in court, though, because I think it captures something important about how family members who love a difficult person can still, ultimately, choose a child's welfare over old loyalties, and because his testimony affected the courtroom in a way I hadn't anticipated. Uncle Paul was called on the second day, after Carol Ibarra's financial testimony and before my mother took the stand. He was 74 years old, a retired postal worker, a soft-spoken man who had never, in my entire life, raised his voice at a family gathering. And I think that mild, reluctant quality made his testimony land with unusual force, because it was so clearly not the testimony of someone eager to settle a score. "I want to say, for the record," he told the court, before Patricia had even asked her first question, "that Linda is my sister, and I love her. And none of what I'm about to say comes easily to me." Patricia asked him to describe the 2 visits he'd mentioned to Daniel, and he did, carefully, in the specific, understated language of a man unused to public speaking. He described visiting for a holiday gathering about a year and a half into Ava's stay, and noticing that Ava sat at the edge of the room during the gift exchange, not because she wasn't invited to participate, but because, he said, she seemed to be waiting to be told it was okay to come closer, rather than just coming closer the way kids usually do at that kind of thing. He described a second visit, closer to 2 years in, where he'd offered Ava a second helping of pie at dinner and watched her glance quickly toward my mother before answering, a small, almost imperceptible check-in that he said he hadn't been able to stop thinking about since. "I didn't say anything at the time," he told the court, and I watched him falter slightly here, the only moment in his testimony where his composure genuinely cracked. "I told myself it wasn't my place, that every family has its own rhythms, that maybe I was reading too much into a shy kid's mannerisms. I've thought about that decision every day since Daniel called me about all this. I keep thinking, if I had said something sooner, if I had asked Linda directly what was going on, maybe some of this could have been caught earlier. I'm testifying today because I don't want to be one more person who noticed something and said nothing, and I'd rather my sister be angry with me for the rest of my life than let that continue to be true." Gregory, on cross-examination, tried gently to establish that Uncle Paul's observations were, by his own admission, brief impressions from occasional family gatherings rather than sustained, close observation of daily life in the household. A fair point, and one Patricia had prepared us to expect. But I watched Judge Yamamoto's face during this cross-examination, and I noted, in her later written ruling, a specific reference to Uncle Paul's testimony that suggested it had mattered more than Gregory's cross-examination might have hoped. She wrote, "While the court gives appropriately limited independent weight to the observations of a family member present only occasionally, the court notes that Mr. Reyes's account, describing a child who habitually sought permission before accepting ordinary comforts such as a second helping of food, corroborates, from an entirely independent source with clear personal reluctance to testify against his own sister, the pattern of learned deference described by both the child's teacher and the child's own written statement to the court." I called Uncle Paul that evening, after his testimony, mostly to thank him, and he told me something I've thought about often since. I keep thinking about all the family dinners I sat through, all those years, thinking to myself, something's a little off here, and not saying anything because I didn't want to make a scene, because I told myself it wasn't serious enough to justify the discomfort of bringing it up. I think a lot of us do that. I think a lot of families have someone who noticed something years before it became undeniable, and who talked themselves out of saying so because the cost of speaking up felt bigger, in the moment, than the cost of staying quiet. I don't want to be that person anymore. I'm 74 years old. I don't have that many more years left to get things right, and I'd rather spend them saying the uncomfortable thing than staying comfortable and quiet. I think about Uncle Paul's testimony often, more than almost anything else from those 2 days in court, because it reminds me that the people who eventually help a child in trouble are not always the ones with the most information or the most legal standing. Sometimes they are simply the ones willing, finally, after years of noticing and staying silent, to say the uncomfortable thing out loud, even at real personal cost, even against their own sister, because a 9-year-old's safety mattered more, in the end, than the discomfort of speaking up. I haven't spent much time in this account talking about Melissa directly, and I want to correct that before I finish, because I think it matters. Because everything that happened to Ava in that house happened, in part, because the one person who would never have allowed any of it was no longer alive to prevent it. And I don't want her memory to disappear into the background of a story about custody hearings and bank statements. Melissa was, in the simplest terms I can offer, the most naturally attentive mother I have ever personally known. I don't say that to romanticize her now that she's gone. People do that, I know, smoothing the rough edges off the dead until they become saints. And Melissa would have hated that. She had a sharp sense of humor about her own flaws and would have rolled her eyes at anyone turning her into a plaster saint. But in the specific matter of noticing what her daughter needed, she really was remarkable. In a way that I think threw the contrast with my mother's caregiving into even starker relief once Melissa was no longer there. I remember visiting them when Ava was maybe 4, watching Melissa in the kitchen while Ava colored at the table, and noticing how Melissa would glance over every few minutes. Not anxiously, just attentively, the way you check a simmering pot without needing to hover over it. At one point, Ava asked for a snack, and Melissa, without missing a beat in the conversation she and I were having, said, "Sure, baby, help yourself to the apple slices in the fridge, or I can cut you something if you want." And Ava said she'd get the apple slices herself, and did, and came back to the table satisfied, and the whole exchange took maybe 15 seconds and required no negotiation, no assessment of whether asking was appropriate, no anxious calculation of whether today was a day requests were welcome. I think about that 15-second exchange often because it is the exact opposite of the pattern Dr. Bloom spent a year helping Ava unlearn. The "am I allowed to want this" calculation that had become so deeply embedded by the time Ava came to live with Daniel that it took months of consistent reassurance to soften. Melissa had built, in 6 years of parenting, an environment where a child's wants were simply met with warm, uncomplicated attention, no cost-benefit analysis required. My mother, in 3 years, had built the opposite, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the difference between those two environments is, in some sense, the entire emotional core of this story. Daniel told me, during one of our long phone calls in that difficult first year after the custody ruling, that one of the things that haunted him most was wondering what Melissa would have thought, watching from wherever she was, if she could have seen what happened to their daughter in that house. "I keep imagining her furious," he said. "Not sad, furious. Melissa didn't really do quiet grief when someone she loved was being hurt. She got mad, and then she fixed things." I think about her watching Ava eat that bologna sandwich alone, hiding in a bathroom stall so nobody would see it, and I think, Melissa would have burned the whole world down before she let that happen for one single day, let alone 3 years. I think part of why I fought as hard as I did in that courtroom is that I felt like I was fighting for both of us, like I owed her that. I think that's true, and I think it's part of why this case, once the facts finally came to light, moved as decisively as it did. Not because Daniel wanted revenge on our parents, but because he was determined to give his daughter the kind of fierce, uncomplicated protection her mother would have given her without a second thought. The kind neither of our parents had managed to provide in Melissa's absence. There's a particular memory I want to include here, one Daniel shared with me only recently, almost 3 years after all of this began, because I think it belongs at the end of this story rather than buried somewhere in the middle. About 6 months after Ava moved in with Daniel permanently, on what would have been Melissa's birthday, Daniel took Ava to the small park where he and Melissa used to bring her as a toddler, and they sat together on a bench. And Ava, unprompted, said, "I think Mom would be really proud of you for getting me back." Daniel told me he didn't trust himself to speak for a long moment. Then he asked her what she meant by getting me back, since technically, legally, she had never left his custody at all. "I mean, like, really back," Ava said, with the plain, devastating clarity children sometimes have about things adults spend paragraphs dancing around. Not just living at your house, like, back to being someone who gets to ask for things. "I don't think I was really all the way here before, even when I was living at Grandma's. I think I was kind of hiding somewhere, waiting to see if it was safe to come out. And then, you found out what was happening, and you got me back. All the way back. And now, I don't have to hide anymore." I don't know that I have anything to add to that. An 11-year-old girl in a park where her parents used to bring her as a toddler, describing her own rescue in language more precise and more devastating than anything a courtroom or a forensic accountant or a private investigator ever managed to produce. That is, in the end, what this entire ordeal was actually about. Not proving my mother wrong, not punishing anyone for spite, not winning some family argument I'd been quietly losing for years. It was about getting a little girl all the way back, out of hiding, into a life where asking for a second helping of mashed potatoes could be the most ordinary thing in the world again. I think Melissa would be proud of Daniel too. I think, in whatever way these things work, she already is. If you've stayed with me through all of this, I want to leave you with one more thing, because I think it's the piece of this story most likely to actually help someone reading it who is standing where I once stood, noticing something small and uncomfortable, and trying to decide whether it's serious enough to justify the discomfort of acting on it. It is. If you're asking the question, it probably is. I spent 3 years telling myself that my parents were simply not warm people, that a bedroom without toys and a comforter with faded roses were just evidence of an old-fashioned household rather than evidence of neglect, that a grandmother who found daily lunch preparation too much work for one kid was tired rather than negligent. I had every piece of information I needed to act much sooner than I did. I had it in the form of small, easily dismissed observations, the kind that never individually justify the discomfort of confrontation, and I let those small observations accumulate for years before a single phone call about a bologna sandwich finally broke through my own carefully constructed denial. I don't say this to punish myself publicly, though I have spent plenty of private hours doing exactly that. I say it because I think the most common failure in situations like this one isn't cruelty. It's the slow, comfortable accumulation of small dismissals made by people who love the child in question and would never consciously choose to let her suffer, but who find, again and again, reasons not to look too closely at the thing sitting quietly in front of them. Look closely. Write things down. Ask the people with no stake in the outcome what they've noticed. And when the pattern becomes undeniable, and it usually does, if you're willing to actually see it, act on it immediately, whatever it costs, because the cost of acting is never as high as the cost a child pays for every additional day you wait. Ava is safe now. She asks for seconds. She plays soccer on Saturday mornings and keeps a diary and calls her grandfather just to tell him about her week. And on a good day, when the light is right and the mood is easy, she still lets her grandmother help hang a picture frame in her room. None of that came easily, and none of it came quickly, and none of it came without real cost to every adult in this story who had to sit with the truth of what had happened and decide what to do about it. But she asks for seconds now. That is worth every single thing it costs to get her there. Since this all happened, I've talked about it with enough people, friends, a few coworkers who went through something similar with their own extended families, even a woman I met at Ava's soccer games whose situation, once she heard The Shape of Ours, turned out to rhyme uncomfortably with her own, that I've started to notice the same handful of questions coming up again and again. I want to answer a few of them here, plainly, because I think the answers matter more than the drama of the courtroom scenes. Honestly, even though the courtroom scenes are the part people usually want to hear about first. The first question is almost always some version of, how did you know it wasn't just an overreaction? How did you know you weren't simply catastrophizing an ordinary, if imperfect, family arrangement? I want to be honest that I didn't know, not with certainty, not at the beginning. What I had, instead of certainty, was a specific escalating pattern that kept failing every test I applied to explain it away. A messy room could be explained, a single missed appointment could be explained, but a bedroom with no toys, no photographs, no evidence a child actually lived there, combined with a 3-year gap in medical care, combined with a lunch a child would rather starve through than reveal, combined with a grandmother who described feeding her granddaughter as not running a 5-star restaurant. At some point, the number of things requiring an innocent explanation exceeds what any single innocent explanation can reasonably cover. That's the test I'd offer anyone in a similar position, not, is there an explanation for this one thing? Because there almost always is. But, how many separate things now require their own separate innocent explanation? And does that number feel sustainable? Or does it feel like I'm building an increasingly elaborate structure just to avoid a much simpler, much more uncomfortable one? The second question people ask is about the money. Specifically, whether I think my mother set out, from the very beginning, with some calculated plan to profit off her granddaughter's care. I don't think that's quite right, and I want to be precise about why, because I think the more accurate answer is actually more useful to anyone trying to recognize this pattern early. I don't believe my mother sat down in year 1 and thought, I am going to systematically divert my granddaughter's support money into my own savings account while denying her medical care. I think what actually happened was smaller and more gradual and, in its own way, more insidious. A series of individually minor decisions, each one rationalized in the moment, that compounded over time into something that looked, from the outside and, eventually, in a courtroom, exactly like a calculated scheme, without ever requiring her to consciously experience it as one. Skip one checkup because scheduling felt like a hassle that particular week. Put an extra $50 in savings one month because the grocery bill came in lower than expected and it felt reasonable to bank the difference. Tell the school a small lie about a coat because admitting she hadn't gotten around to buying one felt more embarrassing, in that specific moment, than the lie did. None of these, taken as a single choice on a single day, feels like the architecture of harm. It's only in aggregate, across 1,000 small choices over 3 years, that the architecture becomes visible, And I think that's exactly why so many people caught in these patterns never fully register what they're doing until someone else lays the whole thing out in front of them, dated and itemized, the way Carol Ibarra and Ms. Okafor and Frank Wisniewski eventually did for my mother in that courtroom. The third question, the one that's hardest to answer honestly, is whether I've forgiven her. I don't think forgiveness is really the right frame for what I've settled into, if I'm honest. I don't carry active hatred for my mother. I don't think that would be good for me, and I don't think it would be good for Ava, who still, cautiously, wants her grandmother in her life and deserves the chance to have that relationship develop as far as it honestly can. But I also don't think I've arrived at the kind of full, warm forgiveness that erases the weight of what happened, and I've come to believe that's not actually a failure on my part. I think there's a version of moving forward that doesn't require forgiveness in the traditional sense, a version built instead on clear-eyed acceptance of who someone is, what they're capable of on their best days and their worst ones, and a set of boundaries calibrated to that reality rather than to some idealized version of who I wish they were. I love my mother. I also know, with total clarity now, exactly what she is capable of doing when her own comfort competes with a child's basic needs, and I will never again extend her the kind of unquestioning trust I extended for the first 36 years of my life. Both of those things are true at once, and I've stopped trying to resolve them into a simpler, tidier feeling. The fourth question, and I think this is the one that matters most for anyone reading this who might be standing where I once stood, is simpler. Was it worth it? Yes. Without hesitation, without qualification, yes. I lost a year of easy family holidays. I spent money I'd rather have spent on almost anything else. I said things to my mother and heard things from her that I will carry for the rest of my life. I watched my father cry on a witness stand and my Uncle Paul's voice shake as he testified against his own sister. None of that was easy, and none of it was free. And if you had told me 5 years ago that I would spend a year of my life hiring a private investigator to document my own parents' failures as caregivers, I would not have believed you. But Ava asks for seconds now. She plays soccer and keeps a diary and calls her grandfather just to talk. She is, by every measure that actually matters, a safe, thriving, loved 11-year-old girl. And she is that because a group of people, her father, her aunt, a teacher who kept a folder in her desk drawer, a great uncle who finally said the uncomfortable thing out loud, a judge who read a set of private text messages back to their author in a quiet, unhurried voice, refused to let a comfortable silence stand in for the truth any longer. Whatever it cost to get her there, it was worth every bit of it, and I would spend it all again tomorrow if I had to.